Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Searching for Dragons. I'm Snappy, and thank you for joining me for our incredible episode here. I'm joined by my dear friend and co-host, Graham. How's it going, Graham?
Alive and working with that.
We're alive, we're here. Life is wild and beautiful, and we're here for part
Yeah.
two, our deep dive into the obliteration of the world, the occult belief system of Antonin Artaud by Peter Valente. Right. So, for those of you who are tuning in, this is the second part of our deep dive into this book. So, if you are looking for more context, please return to part one and dive in there. You don't necessarily need to read or to check out part one because we're looking at 5 different essays. And so, this is going to be sort of 2 self contained essays to end off this discussion. But if you're not familiar with Artaud and you want to dive into the book, please go check out part one. But to get us set up and just to remind people, let's discuss a bit about Artaud. So, who is Artaud, Graham? What is his relation to magic? What does he relate? How does he relate to you? And what is this book?
Big questions. Artaud's tour de force, you could say. Um,
Amazing.
born in born in the late 1800s, died 1948. And during that time, he created what he calls the theater of cruelty. He's one of the pivotal figures in theater in the past 200 years, along with Bertolt Brecht. Um, just revolutionized the way that we approach theater, which is through a magical lens and reliving mythopoetic elements in real life. You know, it's sort of like the magic he desired to create ended up being instilled upon himself and for
Absolutely.
transformative experiences.
Absolutely. He sort of invokes upon
And
himself a apotheosis or an apocalypse, we would say. And what's
yeah,
wild about
and
Artaud is like he's really returning back to taking the theater back to its mystical Bacchic roots, right? And this kind of
exactly.
Bacchic element is sort of essential from our perspective to understand Artaud, the obliteration of the self, ripping apart the self like the Faunis, going through the path of Attis. All this kind of wildness is here in Artaud's
He
work,
wants he wants to use ritual magic in theater to shatter our perspectives of ourselves and our very reality.
right? And to become the hidden god, to destroy, to destroy the god and also become the god at the same time.
Exactly. You
And
know, when he was briefly involved with what he called the Théâtre Alfred Jarry, the Alfred Jarry Theater, and they used dismemberment as a chorus theme to their productions, where they would dismember mannequins on stage to represent the cruelty and pain of life,
and as we
and
know,
how
right,
you have to undergo the dismemberment to reform into something new and
right.
powerful.
And to put this into an occult context, this is the central rite of the Maenads of the Bacchae, right? Euripides' Bacchae, one of the most celebrated pieces of theater of the ancient Greek tradition, and the central ritual of the sparagmos, the ripping apart of the person, usually would be a fetus, a dead child, and the eating of the flesh. And that infamously in the Bacchae happens to the tyrant Pentheus. They rip him apart and eat his flesh. But this is also seen, though, in many ways as this sort of mystical awakening, right? Because within this sort of Bacchic tradition, right, you're dealing with the dying and rising God that goes through the cycles of refinement, that rises to the heights of the ideal. And to transcend the earth, you have to set yourself ablaze, be ripped apart, right? Be obliterated. And so we see this as sort of a duality. Take, for example, the figure of Orpheus, right? Orpheus, who is the grand mystic of this Bacchic Orphic tradition, and they are ripped apart. And the question, do they achieve an apotheosis in that moment, or is it a rebuke? Is it a return to the cycles, right? A lot of this has been lost to us, or Dionysus Zagreus, the child who's pursuing the lapis lazuli, the spinning top, right? Who then is ripped apart by the Titans,
By the Titans.
mirroring the image of Phanes, the divine androgyne, right? Who is tormented by Eros, the gadfly, and rips himself apart. And this mirrors so many other classical magical stories like we see in Hinduism, with Prajapati or the Purusha, right? The cosmic man who rips himself apart to know the other. And Artaud, we know, is extremely well versed in all of this. He spent much of his time studying in libraries. If anyone doubts this, go check out The Crowned Anarchist Heliogabalus.
Heliogabalus.
And see the level of his Greco-Roman scholarship. He's a tour de force as a creative person. So this is kind of where we're coming at. I'm personally deeply interested in the Dionysian magic. Graham is coming at this from a theatrical background. Together, we come together both just utterly amazed by Artaud. And now we're really happy to engage with the work here of Peter Valente, who's also someone who's incredibly well informed in poetry. He's a accomplished translator, a lover of Artaud and of the occult. He's done several works on these subjects and several different translations. And he seeks to try to, right, and a filmmaker as well. And really what he seeks to do with these 5 essays is he attempts to sort of create a loose sort of mystical framework by going directly to the source work of Antonin Artaud, which I really appreciate. He's going to his letters, he's going to his writings, to unpublished material that none of us have seen because we don't read the French nor have access. So this is also such a revealing set of essays, and he compares them and he puts them in his time and his place with the sort of occultic things that are happening at the time, right? Artaud is famously a part of the Surrealist movement in its early beginnings, though he eventually separates. And he's also tangentially connected to the Cubist movement, Cubism, through his friendship with what's the name?
Georges Braque.
Georges Braque.
And Picasso as well. Picasso was actually going to supply illustrations to one of Artaud's poems, but he ended up doing his own drawings instead.
Wow, right. Artaud is kind of famous for his friendships as much as for his radical philosophy. He was sort of just well known throughout that Parisian community before he had his, internment in the institutions. But yeah, beautiful, interesting stuff. So talk to us a bit, Graham, about the first couple essays that we read from Peter Valente.
Right. So in part 1, we went through an introduction and then 2 of the 5 essays. Artaud's Sacred Triad, which centers him around Kabbalah and Tarot, and Cubism and the Gnostic, which is pretty self-explanatory.
Right. And these were both also great because they were informed, as we said, by personal letters, like letters that he had written to Barak and letters that he had written to friends about the tarot and Kabbalah, so really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
What was your general takeaway from Peter Valente and his perspective on these things?
I think he's hitting the nail right on the head. It's a lot of people just say, "Oh, Artaud was mad and insane," and kind of gets swept under the rug a lot of the time, or he gets overly attached to overly emphasizes attachment to Gnosticism, which is is there, but it's peripheral. He's sort of drawing from a deeper, more ancient source for a lot of his magic.
This is the thing. What I immediately noticed, what I noticed with Artaud was that connection because of Heliogabalus, right? This clearly sets him within the Attis cult, and then the theater clearly sets him within the Dionysian. And those people who have a classical background recognize that these two cults are kind of one and the same. They kind of, the Greco-Roman world is complicated and it takes on different phases across time and place, but Attis and Dionysus are interchangeable, right? And they're both connected to this goddess Cybele. And Heliogabalus, right, is the worshiper of Cybele. He seeks to become Cybele, to literally go through this process of divine imitation. And what I love so much about that book and what really rocked my world is that Artaud has a possession experience where he is possessed by Heliogabalus and he performs that book. And then the book is composed based upon the performance. You know, it's such a
That was
radical, magical thing.
totally several of his texts. He would recite or perform them and have someone record it, and then he would go through after and refine it, which is
Which is
pretty
an
wild.
interesting way, really interesting way to
There's
compose.
oh yeah, in the intro to Heliogabalus, his friend says, Artaud at the cafe pouring out magic again, claiming I am Heliogabalus because he's everything he writes, or he becomes everything he writes.
That's so beautiful. But I really
Yeah.
appreciated Valente doesn't necessarily go to the Bacchic stuff, which was my one thing so far that my one criticism. But he does do a really good job of connecting him to the contemporary occult world, to Hermeticism and Kabbalah. And he does a really good job of one of the interesting comparisons that to people who not familiar with the occult may not make was he related him to Aleister Crowley, which I thought was really, really beautiful and interesting because on the surface, you know, Crowley is an egoist, at least, you know, from a surface level reading to the general public, Crowley is going to appear as this egoistic, you know, materialistic, cult-driven figure. Whereas like Artaud is anything but a materialist or an egoist. He's seeking to blow up his name. He's seeking to erase himself from history. You know, so on the surface, these people appeared like absolutely antithesis of each other. But when you start to dive in, they're both creating and playing in this occult milieu, and they have that same perspective, this same magical, transcendent perspective about becoming the hidden God. And that's what I thought Valente really struck gold, where he connects it to this hidden God energy, that idea of Amon, right? Or a moon, or the agnosto theo in the Greek texts. And this is something that's all throughout Crowley and is certainly implied all throughout Artaud.
Pretty wild
Right?
stuff.
Really wild stuff. And I also really enjoyed in the Cubist essay, it was really, really awesome because we saw how he's trying to move beyond reality. He's trying to push the bounds and to lift the veil. His criticisms of Cubism, right? He sees the pushing of the boundaries, the breaking down of the symbols, the changing and the playing of dimensions, and he celebrates this. But he's like, go even further, take it even further. And the examples that were given by Valente, and we've also discussed this. We did a discussion on Artaud's art, his 50 drawings to assassinate. You remember the
50
title?
drawings to assassinate. 50 drawings to assassinate magic.
Right. Thank you. And in a lot of those spells, right, they're not symbols, but they're acts of performance turned into a gesture. You know, it's a gesture that's been created into art, right? And it's like an act of force.
He says this drawing is a sensation that has passed into me, and which I wanted to draw absolutely naked, as though death passes in legend or something like that.
Right. So he even
Pretty
moves
wild.
beyond abstraction, and he tries to transform being the ultimate theater performer. His art is ultimately a performance, even though it is non-symbolic, right? And it is transformative, and he would do active things like stab or rip or tear the paper. Famously, we looked at the ones burning it with cigarettes in order to curse, right?
Yeah. Wild
just
stuff.
Just wild stuff. But this is where Artaud's going, even further than the Cubists. And he's really about transcending reality, obliterating the self, achieving this kind of ionic life, right? Entering into the ion, which is a Crowley kind of concept, which comes also from the earlier Greek tradition. But this seems to be where, you know, Crowley and Artaud meet in the Ion,
Yeah.
with the hidden god,
They never
right?
they never knew each other, but they draw from similar
They're ploying,
sources.
they're digging through the same detritus, they're playing in the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
occult milieu. They're both really attracted to the Luciferian French occult schools. People like, um, what do we call it? Like Levi, as well as all of the Martinists. And of course,
yeah.
Crowley is into the Golden Dawn. I'm not sure how much someone like Artaud would be aware of that, but he certainly would be tangentially aware, because Breton was, his connection to the surrealists puts him firmly within the Crowley milieu, because many of Crowley's pupils and later students and people who influenced him were surrealists, so they're all so deeply interconnected here.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of what our thoughts about the first one. Do you have anything else to say about the first couple essays before we dive into this
No,
next
I
part?
I think that's a good summary.
All right, so let's go look at this next one. So what's this next essay that we're going to be diving into?
This is
Oh,
called Artaud's Book of the Dead, and it's about his discussion where he explains the concept of the bardo, but in a new framework, as being connecting it to electroshock.
so for those of people
So
who are unaware, the bardo is within Tibetan forms of Buddhism, the Vajranara esoteric forms of Tibetan Buddhism. There's this whole process of the bardo, which for monks and people is a whole way of approaching death, so that you can pass through the cycles of death and achieve a sort of an apotheosis, in a sense. Die in a peaceful, best way without attachment, right?
exactly. So he describes it as a liminal space between life and death.
Right, the
And
bardo.
he was subjected to electroshock, I think, 51 times. And he's the electro old this is the old electroshock. It's not like modern electroconvulsive therapy, which I've had before, which is quite safe. Back then, there's no anesthetic and no muscle relaxants, and the patient was conscious while they were performing electroshock. And its whole point is to induce a seizure, a controlled seizure. And in after original electroshock, there would be like they'd be comatose for about 30 minutes as a result of the treatment. And then during one of these treatments, actually, he was declared medically dead. And then as they were taking his body away, he like came back to life. And then they kept doing the electroshock treatments. And so he says that electroshock creates a false bardo state, or a new liminal state of existence, where I don't want to give it away too much of it, but basically he believes there are beings that live inside this liminal state that feed off of the person in bardo.
Oh wow. And that to me just is so similar to myths we see in the Greco-Roman and other pagan traditions of these liminal spaces, where you have the spirits of the crossroads, the manes, and the spirits of mania who feed on the dead.
Totally, totally. So let's dive in. The Tibetan word bardo literally means intermediate state or a liminal state. It refers to the state of existence between two lives on earth. After death and before one's next birth, when one's consciousness no longer inhabits a physical body, one experiences a variety of phenomena. These phenomena follow a particular sequence of degeneration from the clearest experiences of reality that one is spiritually capable of to the terrifying hallucinations that arise from one's lack of spiritual skill in the previous life. So, for the Tibetan Buddhist, the bardo offers to prepared and appropriately trained individuals the potential for liberation, since the experience of direct reality after death can lead to a transcendental insight. And yet, for others, it can become a dangerous place, as the hallucinations created by karma can impel one into a less than desirable rebirth. But for Artaud, there is no liberation or transcendental insight to be gained in the bardo. In this state, Artaud only experiences a ceaseless attack by the other on his body, which is helplessly in electroshock because emptied of the will.
Whoa. So he gets emptied of the will through this electroshock. And for him, there is no insight to be gained by experiencing this liminal space. All there is to
Is it
be
the
eaten
false
by the
space?
hungry ghosts, right?
Exactly.
Oh wow. That's wild.
Artaud's most sustained description of the Bardo state occurs in a letter to Mathieu Robert, written on May 9th, 1946. He immediately states that the Bardo state does not exist, and on the contrary, it is the rituals of the lamas, the bonzes, etc., which after millennia of work on the mind, gave it an existence in order to give themselves, and not to the dead, the torture or reason to exist forever.
They torture a reason to exist. So is he insinuating that the lamas and the bonds, like the bond shamans, created the bardo as a place where they can live beyond death in order to exist forever and to feed on humanity?
Yeah, yeah, pretty wild.
Whoa! Now that is getting into some dark,
He talks
vampire
later on
stuff.
about he went to Mexico, perceived a lot of things there, and then it never happened, but he wanted to travel to Tibet to destroy these lamas performing like sexual magic to like feed off of him in Bardo. Pretty wild
Wild.
stuff. For Artaud, the Bardo state was a false state induced during electroshock. It was here that he felt most vulnerable to attacks, and where he suffered the invasion of beings who violated his body by entering through the orifices and pores in his skin. For Artaud, the human body is a battlefield, and his war against the spirit takes place primarily in Bardo. Furthermore, he writes, now there is nothingness, now death, now putrefaction, now resurrection. To wait for I don't know what apocalypse beyond that, what explosion of what beyond in order to get straightened out with things is a dirty joke. For Artaud, this being that suffered death and resurrection is the false Christ in the Christian myth. Artaud would later envision himself as the true Christ, the one who suffered and was forced to rebuild his life after the experiences at the Rodez Asylum. For Artaud, it is the spiritual traditions of the Bonds and the Lamas that worked on the mind over millennia to give these spirits an existence with which to torture the body and life and after death. The very thought of the Bardo causes it to materialize in the mind. For Artaud, it is not from death that the dead suffer, but from the living. And there is no God, heaven, hell, unnatural states, or unthinkable beings to meet when one is dead, but there are unnatural succubations and incubations.
That's wild. Again, we're seeing the double imagery with Artaud, and this is another occulted magical thing, right? Famously, Artaud wrote that manifesto, the theater,
The
and
true,
its double.
yeah.
And what else were you gonna say, sir?
No, no. Oh, I was just gonna say he wrote. Never mind, I lost it.
It doesn't matter, right? But that double imagery is such an important magical thing, the Gemini, and we see this throughout the Western tradition. This idea of with the twins, sometimes it's one has to die in order for the other to rise. There's the slaying of the twin, and other times it's a merging right into one being. But there's a couple different ways that kind of duality plays out. But ultimately, you have to confront the other and either enter into a symbiosis or destroy the other, right?
Exactly. I was
Wild
gonna
stuff.
say he wrote the manifesto, the true story of Jesus Christ, where he talks all
Right.
about being comparing Rodez to Golgotha and his
You know,
his crucifixion as the electroshock.
and this idea within forms of esoteric Christianity of the false Christ, right? Like this, you see this even within the modern Bible with that idea of Jesus Barabbas, right? Barabbas is going to be killed, as well as Jesus. They both have the same name, and the crowd is allowed to set one of them free, and famously the crowd chooses to free Barabbas, Jesus the murderer, whereas they allow Jesus the prophet to be crucified. And this is a really interesting thing. How are there two Jesuses up there? Like, right?
Right? Yeah.
you know and it just screams a lot of this, also the scapegoat stuff, right? You see
Yeah,
this in the Bible as well as within the Greek tradition, this idea of, right, you have one has to be cast out for the other to live, right?
exactly. And so this
Right.
sort of like there's a double that's created by the electroshock as well, of like a false shadow.
And again, this is also something that connects us to the Bacchic mysteries. Yeah, there's the Dithyrambos that my friend Gandhi is reminding me, which is to die twice. And, Dionysus is the twice born. He is the Dithram, you know. And this is also a form of poetic expression, right? It gets so deep and wild with this stuff.
It does. Let's keep reading.
Yeah.
The sexes of living llamas, who under the pretense of guidance or instruction, ceaselessly attract to themselves the remains of the living ancients. These beings that are alive torture the dead Artaud under electroshock. The dead are simply victims of an attack from the sexes of living llamas, born from the sexual mysticism of the East, who, under a pretense of spiritual guidance to enlightenment, ceaselessly attract to themselves the remains of the oldest living beings. They insinuate themselves into the mind. Thus, the bardo was created. Artaud writes, "These beings that are alive torture the dead are." Oh, he writes, sorry. "Try as they might to make us believe, we gain no profit from the notion that we will be dead men, going back to the dead, taking our places in the legion of the dead, letting our limbs separate from ourselves, and falling down into a heap in the spherical charnel houses.
Wow.
There is no heaven or hell, and the resurrection of Christ was to Artaud one of those grotesque masquerades of acts and sentiments, without any real existence in fact. For Artaud, one doesn't die in order to come back and remake one's life, but only in order to give up life and get rid of whatever life one had. It is not the transformation of the body, but its rebirth, damaged and in a diminished state. In the Bardo, Artaud was tortured by the Buddhist monks and lamas because he resists this rebirth in the false body, helpless because dead, which is not the body without organs, the truly liberated body. Furthermore, he writes, all states of death are arbitrary inventions imposed by the sexual gluttony of the living, of which the entire earth reaps the benefits and the initiated the hypocritical interest. The entire cycle of births perpetuates for Artaud an incredible proliferation. For Artaud, any birth is a violation of his own autonomy, that self whose existence.
So let's just pause here for a second because I want to talk about some of this because we're getting pretty wild here, right? So this whole idea of this kind of, through the death we achieve this higher rebirth, and he's rebelling against this, right? This is such an ancient magical idea, right? We clearly see that within Jesus, right? He dies and he's resurrected, but this is also something that comes much earlier from the Greco-Roman tradition, right? We have famously Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, who the moment she's about to be sacrificed is magically transported to the temple of Artemis, right, where she is made into this empowered queen. In many of the stories of Helen never actually goes to Troy, but rather a ghostly visage, a magical double of her, and she herself is saved and transported to the temple of Isis in Egypt or in Libya, right? So there's all this kind of wild double kind of stuff that Artaud is playing on that I'm almost certain that he is aware of, you know?
Oh,
And
definitely.
but he's ultimately rejecting a lot of that. He doesn't want, he sees that as a false imprisonment, as becoming one of these black magicians, right? Of becoming these necromantic leeches who live off of the decaying cycle of life, right? Rather than waking up to true life into to ultimate godhood, right? To achieving that ionic life,
Exactly. It's about a recreation, to creating the body without organs.
right? And the body without organs is the body that can give birth to itself, the that which comes out of the
Exactly.
nothing, right? The hidden God again, right?
It is much richer, more real and true, precisely because it is forever unthinkable. And the unthinkable is also a being which one day will replace thought. And you will be the very first on the side where we bury thought itself under the material of thought.
Wow. The unthinkable is also a being. Right? That which we can't even imagine is alive and
And it will
conscious.
replace
Won't
and it
replace
will
us.
replace thought. Will
Replace
replace
thought.
thought.
Replace
Pretty
thought.
wild.
Wow, wow, wow. I don't even.
Let's see where he's going with this.
Yes.
The body without organs is precisely an unthinkable fact, without form and without representation. The unthinkable is more richer and real, precisely because it does not degenerate or decay. It is a force outside time and space. It is a primordial light before the creation and descent from oneness to multiplicity, to the cycle of birth and death. Artaud seeks to regress to the state of the unborn or uncreated, to re-enter the womb of origin, and like an alchemist, to transform the experience of birth. The architecture of man must be rebuilt, which will involve a kind of new magical genesis that does not involve the sexuality of mother and father.
Again, right? We're seeing him walking this alchemical,
Self-born.
right? The alchemical magical path. A lot, all of this, right? Is just we see the same kind of stuff that you see in the Addis path, which we've already talked about in terms of Artaud. But in the alchemical path, what are they trying to do? They're trying to reform the magical rebus. And what is the rebus? The rebus is the seven, the combination of the three and the four, the masculine and the feminine, reforming the divine androgyne, the one that is hidden beyond the veil, our true self beyond multiplicity, right? And it's this idea, once you go down into the base matter, now we have to return and precipitate ourselves back to the original source, a return back to chaos, to the primordial womb of creation, to being in that unborn pre-created state, which is that return to the great mother primal force, right? So yeah, clearly alchemical, clearly in that sort of Addis Dionysian magical perspective. Wild, eh?
Totally. And even in the theater in its double, there's a whole chapter called the Alchemical Theater where a lot more goes into it.
Well, this is a deep, deep part of the Western magical tradition, right? As we see, right? You go to alchemy, you got the Rebbe. You go even earlier, you got Addis. You go even
What's
earlier, you got Fawnies.
what's interesting with Artaud that is stressed in the different book that I have, a collection of all of his theater writings. He doesn't refer to the theater that he's doing as Western theater. It's Eastern. So when he
Which
says
is
West,
interesting.
when he says East and West or Occidental and Oriental, he's referring to frameworks. So like
Mm,
mirror things that are mirrored in African cultures and Greco-Roman cultures and Syrian cultures, um, Balinese theater. Those are all like Eastern, whereas Western or Occidental thought is sort of like the boring European sort of degeneration of what these things once were.
that's true. What I'm talking about I'm trying to connect him to the ancient Western traditions, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And the esoteric magical aspect of the Western tradition, which is occulted and not
Exactly.
mainstream. We're not talking about this humanistic science tradition that
No,
Artaud is
no,
rebelling
that's what
against,
that's
right?
yeah, yeah.
And in many ways, Dionysus, right? We have to acknowledge too, this is an Eastern cult in its origination. They were an Eastern other that was coming into Greece. Attis is a Phrygian god originally that gets incorporated into this Greek pantheon. But there's all this stuff of coming from the East. Dionysus is said to be from the Indian city of Nisa. Anyway, we can go off on wild tangents
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
But yeah,
Totally. Just thought I should stress that
right,
importance
right.
though.
What I'm trying
Yeah.
to get to is he's coming at this from, again, it's the same thing. Like he wants to return back to this primal, um, pre
Unborn.
industrial perspective of engaging with the art and ritual, right? And the same thing that we
Exactly.
see within the ancient Greek theater tradition, you see within the Tarahumara people of Mexico,
Yeah.
right? That he also
Yeah.
loves, you know? Yeah,
Exactly.
let's continue
Exactly.
from here.
Sure. In Martha's prose, Artaud detects a sensibility that accuses the lousy scum of inspectors and guardians, and which evokes so luxuriously the sword which could in part pierce the thick layer of oblivion which separates the sensibility from knowledge, which is merely this acquisition of empirical data based on reasonable hypotheses. This sensibility will soon come forth as the poison which fells knowledge to replace it with reality. This direct confrontation with reality was a preoccupation for Artaud since he began the first essays on the theater of cruelty in the 1930s. In the theater of cruelty, there would be no distance between actor and his audience, and the ancient duality between author and director will fuse together and be replaced by a kind of unique creator to whom it will fall the double responsibility of the spectacle and the action.
I really want to highlight this because this is such an important kind of magical perspective here, and it really connects Artaud to the Germanic line of thought that is happening around the same time in the 30s to people like Klages and to earlier people like Nietzsche, right? And there's this whole idea within both Nietzsche and Klages about this rejection of of our modern Christian perspective. Like they're really outlining it as that Christian perspective, and they want to return back to, and this is the word that Klages uses, to the primitive, right? To that primitive tribal perspective, because he equates this with a perspective that hasn't been weighed down by the detritus of propaganda, propagandized through myth as a form of slavery, you know. And both Nietzsche and Klages and several other Germanic philosophers and pagans and people who are, you know, more open to that perspective are arguing from, right? A lot of
Right.
this, you know, a lot of this anthropology at the time was having such a radical upset. People like the German anthropologist Bachofen, right? When they're looking at these ancient mother cults and they're going into places like Africa, and people are finally, you know, treating these indigenous peoples with respect and looking to them and looking at their way of life not as something you know, debased and culturally ignorant, but as a beautiful form of life. And in the case of people like
Exactly.
Artaud and Nietzsche and Klages, they're literally saying that these people have a more primal, direct perception. They're not caught up in tradition and imagination, right? They can perceive reality. They can see beyond the veil, right?
This was a big thing for Artaud also when he went to Mexico. He went to Richard to instill a revolution that would celebrate the indigenous cultures and have a return to their roots and have them come forth in society. Um, we'll see Bertolt Brecht, of course, as well.
Right.
Around the same
Exactly. This
time, also tried to shatter the audience and the duality between the audience and
this
performance.
this is something that I like. It's such a painful thing for me, you know, as someone who's deeply connected to to the magical and the pagan, because this kind of magical pagan perspective, you know, in Europe at this time almost had this potential for this reconnection to the indigenous, to bring back all of this real empowered perspective, but it gets all caught up with fascism and becomes, you know, just anathema, you know. And
Yeah,
until our modern times, where now people are starting to re-engage a lot of this. But yeah, anyway, just as an
the
aside,
cycle.
right? Yeah, let's continue here.
This direct confrontation with reality that is interrupted in the bardo. Here, according to Tibetan mysticism, is where the body is separated from the consciousness. According to Artaud, the body is stripped of its vital force. The limbs are separated from themselves, and therefore becomes like a puppet that falls victim to a kind of spectral invasion of vampiric beings. Their purpose is to resurrect Artaud against his will. Artaud, who is like the furious Christ of the Parisot letter, and who does not want to be born again. It is the whole body which isn't a spiritual body, but a man's body, which moreover is not a being, which is the true body. This body of Artaud was threatened with extinction in the Bardo.
That's so interesting because, you know, extinction within the bardo is the whole point. Because think
Yeah,
about it, what is the whole idea? We've talked about this before, but when you're really getting into the essence of Buddhist thought, what is the idea, right? We wish to achieve nirvana, to extinguish the light, to blow out our candles, to commit the ultimate death, right? To be in that infinite quiet, right? So, of course, right, the body of Artaud is threatened in the bardo.
yeah,
It's just interesting that their enlightenment for Artaud becomes an ultimate imprisonment, right?
yeah. Well said. It is now time to examine what Artaud says of the experiences of the Bardo during electroshock, the manner in which the body passes through death to be born again, if at all. Artaud writes, I died at Rodez under electroshock. I died. Legally and medically died. Electroshock coma lasts 15 minutes, a half hour or more, and then the patient breathes. Now, 1 hour after the shock, I still had not awakened and had stopped breathing. Artaud writes, at the bedside of a dying man, there are more than 10,000 beings, and I took note of this at that moment. For Artaud, the problem in electroshock is that there is conscious unanimity among all these beings, who are unwilling to let the dead man come back to life before he has paid them by giving up his corpse totally and absolutely. These spirits in the bardo assume the bodies of the dead, and thus take on form better to plague Artaud. At such a time, Artaud writes, all the beings say, I am you, and your consciousness is me. Thus the unique body is degraded in its passage through bardo. As the electroshock continues, he writes, and my whole inward electric body, the whole lie of this inward electric body, which for a certain number of centuries has become the burden of every human being, turned inside out, became in me like an immense turning outwards in flames, monads of nothingness bristling to the limits of existence, held prisoner in my lead body, which could neither get out of its lead coating nor stand up like a lead soldier.
Wow, 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 wow. Right. And this is something that we definitely see in so much of the magical and mystical traditions is this, you know, there's kind of an extreme duality of perspectives that you see, right? Where you have some magical occultists like Artaud who ultimately reject the body. They see the body as nothing but a cheap suitcase and not the real self, and that we need to transcend the body, that the body only exists for but a moment, you know? Um, and then you'll have other occultists who say, no, no, no. This, like someone like Ludwig Klages, who I was mentioning earlier, where the body is an expression of the soul, and is that, you know, the image, the soul is an expression of the body, and they're intimately relinked, just as the idol connects us to the spirit of the divine, right, through the daimonic force,
Right.
right? We our soul needs to be tied to a physical form, you know, in order to have that sort of wholeness of itself. But
Definitely.
this is an interesting kind of thing here.
Definitely. In this line, I am you and your consciousness is me. So Artaud wrote an essay about
Mm,
Le Conte de l'Autrement, the author of Songs of Maldoror,
right.
Isidore Ducasse, who died under mysterious circumstances. And Artaud thinks it's because Ducasse's creation of l'Autrement, this like persona, has will outlive Isidore Ducasse, and that he died from the separation of his consciousness with like this other abstract idea of like
That is a powerful concept, because this is something that, you know, I've never heard it quite framed like this, but a lot of occultists play around with this kind of idea of transforming the self into an ideal, right? And of selling one's soul in order to become that infamous or that famous force, to transform yourself into the symbolic. You know, I've even heard some magical occultists argue, people like, for example, Jimi Hendrix did this, sold their soul to the devil. Now, you know, there's no
yeah.
proof of this other than people's
No.
speculation, but this is how, where a lot of this occult weirdness takes people, and they look at the world through that kind of a lens, where they're seeing people transform themselves in this artistic, inspirational, magical lens into an ideal, and they transcend the self, and they no longer are the self, but there's something greater,
Exactly. Exactly.
right? And then, you know, the real self has to die in order for that magical artistic self to exist, right? This is something also just, you know, fundamental about human nature and storytelling. You know, we see this, the construction of the celebrity, the construction of the icon, the creation of the divinity. You know, this is what Achilles seeks to do. Why does he go to war? Why, you know, why is he engaged in all of this? Because he wants to live forever. And he knows that he'll live forever if he turns himself into song, into symbol, and he becomes that empowered image. He won't survive, but the ideal warrior will survive, right? And so Achilles must become the ideal warrior, right, in order to achieve immortality.
Right.
But we see this so often through so many different ways. I often think about, you know, just like the creation of celebrity. We were talking about this in the previous episode, but like the creation of an artist like Van Gogh, right? Van Gogh, right, is entirely created after death. And he represents the idealized tortured artist, and the reality of the man is lost under the weight of the myth. Or look at Da Vinci, right? Like
Interesting that you
it doesn't
mentioned
even
Van
matter.
Gogh.
Go ahead,
Interesting
sorry.
you mentioned Van Gogh because Artaud actually wrote a large essay called Van Gogh, the Man Suicided by Society.
Wow.
And it is powerful stuff. He evokes imagery from his paintings and talks about his mental tortures, and he didn't really get famous until after his death. I think his brother was the only one who bought his paintings while he was alive.
Yeah, right. And this is the thing in the art world, is that we celebrate the torture in the story.
I was
It's
about to
almost
say that.
like when you brought up Lacan de l'Autrement. So much of his story is because he died mysterious and young, and he only wrote this one epic, right? He becomes this weird, and he's a foreigner. There's so much to his story that is shrouded in mystery that makes his work that much more profound in
Alluring.
some
Yeah.
ways. And you got to wonder, had he been around to write like a bunch of other books, or to change his mind and to give up the Lautremont character, would his work have achieved the same kind
I
of
mean,
transcendence?
he did release a series of writings as a Zodiacast, and yeah, they're not as well known.
Right,
Um, Overshadowed by Lautremont's Maldor.
right. But you know what I mean, right? There's that
I
that
know
that
exactly what you mean. Yeah, had he persisted longer, would there be a rejection of Lautremont or a deeper embrace? Well, like which step would he take is hard to say.
well, there's this whole perception too, right? Like I think about someone like Prince, and I remember as a young person, Prince was such a radical to me. And I'm thinking about this from just that occulted perspective too, right? This is the purple androgyne talking about all this sex and transcendence and, poetic silliness. But then, dude goes and becomes a Jehovah's Witness and gives it all up, you
I
know?
never knew that.
And yeah, and he's a very complex character. And it's like, that's a very human story all of a sudden, and
Totally,
yeah,
totally.
it changes the earlier meaning of his earlier records because of um
True.
it's just
Wild stuff.
interesting, right? Anyway, tangents
I
galore.
love it.
Let's
I
continue.
love it.
let's,
I love
let's
it. Let's keep
continue.
going. Hermes Trismegistus spoke of the monad in the following way. God is the monad that begat a monad and turned it back on itself as a single blast of heat. In Artaud's descriptions, we can see that he is approaching the condition of a god. His material body has been turned inside out. The inner has given way to the outer. The force is not internalized but projected outward into the world. It is as though the body is expanding and contracting. This is also a moment of terror for Artaud when faced with the vast outside, feeling the very limits of his existence and frightening exposure. But at the same time, it is as though the concept of outside inside are being questioned or ripped apart.
Again, right, invoking Hermes Trismegistus and this idea of that supernal monad, right? We're getting now into this idea of the phonies, the thesis, the divine androgyne at the heart of creation again. Hermes Trismegistus, for those who aren't aware, is this pseudo-epigraphical kind of character. It's the god Hermes within the Egyptian tradition, but as the inventor of writing. And
Cool.
this became sort of a nom de plume for many different writers across history, people who were trying to connect themselves to this hermetic tradition. And so Hermes Trismegistus isn't really a character, as he is a costume that is
Of course.
donned by various wizards across history. And it's people who want to connect to that hermetic tradition, this magical Thoth, yeah, Thoth Tahuti is the Egyptian version, but this magical sorceress tradition of Alexandria, right? So anytime you see
Right.
Hermes Trismegistus, you got to both think this is a god, but this is also the Corpus Hermeticum. This
Like
is the all of the
like, like,
various
like
writers who wore this costume.
like the Dread Pirate and the Princess Bride.
Exactly, like the Dread Pirate, But people outside of this, people who aren't into the occult will look at that and they'll be like, they'll scoff. Oh, Hermes wasn't a real guy. all that writing sucks. And they're like, but those into the occult world say, no, Hermes is an ideal that all of these magicians are being enthused by,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
But anyway,
Love it. The concepts of inside are being questioned or ripped apart at the bottom here.
okay.
Um, During electroshock, the body becomes a burdensome weight, unable to move, but finally awakens though he was thought to be dead by the doctors. The living are the doctors who administer electroshock to Artaud. Artaud is patient, undergoes a series of attacks under this procedure by what he calls a criminal mob of beings who force him an extremist before letting him go. The assaults under electroshock are almost always spoken in terms of sexual violations. He writes in a letter of June 22nd, 1946, to Andre Breton, one of my connections, Anne Manson, was assaulted in the office of Doctors Menot and Chanez and stripped naked by them, then fucked on the pretext of being searched. And thus, the terrors of death are sexual terrors.
Wow.
Not because the ego finds itself suspended once again over the abyss of the womb, not because it finds itself once more called by the lips of the male vulva, not because its stature abandoned it, and because from the perception of its stature itself, between 1 meter 55 man and 1 meter 90, it must cross by the thread of the vein, by the vein and by the thread, and that from the extended plane of its march and the solid mass of its weight into the problem of a march thrusting forward tongue or intestines.
Whoa. That's some wild imagery.
Lips of the male vulva and some like
Right?
androgyny kind of stuff there again.
Absolutely, right? The abyss of the womb. This is the chaos gap, right? That's where,
Yeah.
wow.
Well, this sexual birthing gets the crudest pleasure out of him. For Artaud, this birth is a focal point for invasion. It is embedded in the language of the family romance. Pussy toad and boss pussy are the sluttish vocables of father and mother invented. From this birth, Artaud comes into the world only to wallow in vice. He is exposed to the world not to assert his unique body, but to be drainage for angels. He becomes a self in relation to things, placed outside to suffer in relation to the other, a spirit that will take advantage of this relation to insinuate itself, Artaud consciousness. Thus, in electroshock, the life we lead is a front for all which the frightful criminal filthy mindedness of some has left us. And these filthy criminal beings invade and assault Artaud's body. But the physicians tell him that he is in a state of hypertension, and that it is not good to be in a state of hypertension. Artaud responds, I can answer that we are all in a state of frightful hypertension. We can't lose an atom without the risk of immediately becoming a skeleton again. But the body must march through the vein and the thread, and through its thrust itself forth, finally emergent as tongues or intestines.
Whoa.
Furthermore,
Go ahead.
no, you can
Go ahead,
go.
sir.
I was
Yeah,
going to
just
finish
finish
the
the
last
page.
section.
Yeah.
It must come to this falling earth, and I inflate the lung, inflating the mother after, to this terrible bridge of earth, which breaks like an old disjointed floor and thunders in the abyss of nowhere, as if it had been itself become the mammary abyss of nowhere.
The memory abyss of nowhere. But, again, this, if we're just going back here, this really, this imagery immediately to me screams the Addis Gallus stuff, right? What is the story of Addis Gallus? We've talked about this a couple times, but right, Addis is up in the ideal with the Great Mother, living in this perfected harmony, but he falls prey to the shiny nymphs, the beautiful nymphs, and he descends into the mud where he is bound down in the mud with the nymphs in this sexual depravity, right? And then the way you break free of this sexual depravity is to castrate the self, right? To castrate the self and then return to that one through the process of divine imitation, right? To become this androgynous figure, to give up that the male side, which is the one that is bound by vice, and to return to this purity of the virgin, right? To become that pure virgin image. That's what we're seeing within the Addis cult. But this is clearly what Artaud is. He's connecting to that imagery. Really wild
Definitely.
stuff here. Okay, so we were
Next
here.
slide. The body arrives at a terrible bridge of earth, which breaks and transforms from the abyss of nowhere to a memory abyss of nowhere. This is the terror of the body suspended above an abyss that is associated with the female, who in other works Artaud referred to as a death force. The suggestion here is of a violent rebirth from the bardo to waking consciousness. Artaud writes that this is because death breeds nothing but life, and to be dead is to start again as head, bones, memory, lungs, anus, intestinal fibers. The cycle of birth and death renews itself in the Eastern religions. But finally, for Artaud, this is nothing, and this is no terror. For Artaud, one doesn't die in order to come back and remake one's life. This is a false doctrine perpetuated in the various books of the. I can't remember where he goes from here.
Sorry.
No worries. Books of the dead. There is nothing to gain in being dead, not the possibility of resurrection as the Christians believed, nor the reincarnation that the Tibetan monks believed happened. For Artaud, the dead man is really dead, and calling his breath or speaking to or thinking about him in any way whatsoever is in reality to maintain him in a manacle of existence which only obeys the arbitrariness of the guru initiate, even though the dead man is fully dead. That is to say, he is no longer here at all, and it is a crime to speak to him in any manner whatsoever. Life intrudes to breathe the spirit into the body, as God had when he created Adam. But Artaud resists this because he knows that the spirits need a body to drain Artaud vitality, without which they cannot slake their thirst or materialize.
Oh, that is so wild. That is so wild. We're really seeing like almost a rejection of the spiritual, of the ancestral tradition. This is interesting because Artaud is someone so deeply connected to, more primitive cultures, again, for lack of a better term, more indigenous cultures, right? He is really rejecting that whole ancestral worship, the whole reincarnation, the whole thing. He views all of that spirit, the whole remembrance of the dead, he rejects as he sees this as a necromantic rite binding us to this reality. Wow.
Yeah, pretty wild. Pretty wild
You
stuff.
know? So while most people are trying to be remembered, Artaud wants to be forgot.
Yeah,
Whoa.
pretty wild. Pretty wild.
Okay, let's continue.
But words are insufficient to awaken the dead Artaud during electroshock. The words heard in the bardo are not to be trusted. About his experiences under electroshock, Artaud writes, I kept this recollection to myself and secret. The doctors remarked that as Artaud was thought dead, attendants arrived to take him away, but at that point he suddenly awakened. For Artaud, this is the official story. He writes, but I have a different recollection of the affair. He continues, to save a dead man, he must be truly killed when he was dead, and right away. But for billions of years, this has ceased to pertain to anyone, because jealous Petries have taken in front of all the earth's dead the place of this inaccessible someone, and have created and calculated Bardo. Electroshock is a false death, a simulation, which creates a kind of limbo stage, a Bardo state where the body is held suspended and separated from consciousness. It is in this state that Artaud felt the body was defenseless and subject to ceaseless violations by a class of beings called the Pitris. Pitris is a Sanskrit word meaning fathers. In Hinduism, these are the spirits of the dead, of the departed ancestors. They were thought to be immortal like the gods, and the way of the fathers was characterized by observance of traditional practices that led to rebirth. This came to be distinguished from the way of gods, which was based on faith, and whose goal was liberation from reincarnation. It is these fathers who take the place of the absent god and reinforce the chain of rebirth and rebirth. For Artaud, the fathers jealously usurped the place of God, and thus created this intermediate stage, the bardo, as a kind of station on the way to rebirth. But Artaud insists that this state does not exist in reality. For Artaud, the simple reality is that after death there exists a man with pity and memory, the memory of the one who lived. For Artaud, the dead are dead, absolutely, and the angle of living is death, but so as not to suffer in the bardo. Artaud writes that he must be prevented from hearing, seeing, feeling, and knowing, because what is dead is what wants to exist, and there is nothing like a dead man to demand existence.
Wow.
The dead man must be kept from wanting to exist again. He must resist the pull towards a rebirth. But for Artaud, the dead man's consciousness is instructed by a guru and master, and furthermore, the dead man believes himself to be a guru. Here, consciousness is unstable and the I is replaced by another. The dead man is, on the contrary, guru and master. And a time comes which does not last very long when the dead man eats the guru who claimed he could teach him, and who was often another dead man, since the living are the already dead. Which means that death and life are in the present time two abominable state parodies of being where we are always eaten by someone. And when I say Bardo doesn't exist, I mean that it exists temporarily only because beings have caused it.
Okay, we got to pause here because again, this is more of that kind of dying, that Dionysian wildness, right? The dying and rising god who is eaten in his rites. You rip him apart and you eat him. You know, you drink his blood and eat his flesh in these Maenadic rites, right? This is
Right.
so freaking wild, Arto.
Yeah, I love that. Death and life are in the same present time, two abominable states of being, parodies of being, where we're always eaten by someone. I love that.
Right,
You
right.
know,
We're
like
caught in that cycle.
as he says in another text, life is always someone else's death.
Right. Life is always someone else's death. Very true. Very true.
We subsist on the flesh of the dead, whether they be plants, fungi, mammals, or beasts. You know, we have to eat on them to survive, and they have to eat things to survive. And
Yeah,
like, where does it end?
this is the true
Where does the
nature of
consumption end?
reality. You know, there is no love without death, no life without death. They're intrinsically related to one another, right? We are always in a constant state of being born and dying.
Exactly. But in these times, one does not need to be dead to go through it. But for Artaud, those who are alive are also dead. He writes, and so on the surface of daily life, consciousness forms beings and bodies that one can see gathering and colliding in the atmosphere to distinguish their personalities. And these bodies form hideous cabals where every eventuality comes into the world to argue against what is beyond appeal. The dead man must eat, consume the guru in a kind of terrible Eucharist. These had a palpable effect on the mind that devastated the autonomy of the body. Artaud continues his Book of the Dead by speaking of the dead man's loss of consciousness. I also mean that causing a dead man to lose consciousness of the very person of his being, as Tibetan gurus do, is a crime. Because killing a dead man, as I say, is to immediately make him reach that depth of being after which he must return.
Wow.
The guru's objective was to capture the consciousness of the dead, to tear them away from them. It is a kind of criminal disemboweling of the dead man. Artaud attributes this crime to the Tibetan guru who perpetuates it in his mystical thinking about it. And thus the dead man reaches a certain depth, after which he must return, i.e., he is forced to be reborn. But for Artaud, it is not only the dead who suffer from the bardo, but also the living. But the bardo states are better reached in life than in death, because that is when one is no longer conscious, and because consciousness of the other side is bad, being that which no longer has to do with a particularized body, but with a universalized spirit, where one hears all the toads, frogs, sphinxes, parrots, bears, cats, infected crickets, cave rats, mammoths, brontosaurus iguanas, crocodiles, and cruel seals, from all the aborted bodies of men thus transformed into animal spirits. Intestinal larvae of non-being that want to embrace all that has been.
Wow. The intestinal larvae of non-being. You know that the larvae, that word, you know where that originates from? The larvae are spirits of the dead in Latin,
Ah,
right?
amazing.
So oh, Arto, totally wild craziness.
He always knows what's up.
Yeah. Okay. Let's
So
continue here.
I just missed the last sentence from the
Oh,
previous
I'm
one
sorry.
to lead into it. No, the living for Artaud are no better off than the dead. They are no, we can keep going, sorry. They are no longer conscious, and thus subject to the influence of the other, as in the Bardo state or electroshock. When men are no longer conscious, the other consciousness, which is bad, is activated and usurps the waking consciousness. The source of its evil is that it no longer has to do with the particularized body, but with the universalized spirit. For Artaud, the body is an empty shell in Bardo, and in the Bardo state, the dead man is also subject to auditory hallucination. In fact, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is also known as the Great Liberation through Hearing in the intermediate state, or Bardo.
So I
But for
looked it up
Artaud,
and
there,
I just wanted to say I looked it up trying to remember the direct translation for larvae, and it actually literally means ghosts
oh,
or
amazing.
specter or mask.
Wow, or mask. That's
Yeah,
interesting. 'Cause the mask is so important in the theatrical game.
right, right. Artaud knows what language he's using.
He's hitting the nail on the head.
But yeah, sorry to
But
interrupt.
For Artaud, there is no liberation in hearing, which for the Tibetan Buddhist refers to a kind of mystical state that leads to a proper reincarnation. It is as if the sounds of the various beasts that are man transformed into animal spirits creates a cacophony of noise. And furthermore, Artaud writes, these beasts are not in death, but are those which are in life, and which want to make the dead man hear in order to take away what life has left him. These spirits are the larvae of non-being that want to attach themselves to the evacuated body in order to exist. These spirits are as alive as the Petries are thought to be in the Tibetan religion. In fact, for the Tibetan Buddhist, the present moment is a continual bardo suspended between the past and the future. For
Yeah,
Artaud, this other is no
momentariness.
more than what all. Sorry.
So I just want to. So this is what they're getting at is in Buddhism you have the doctrine of momentariness, that reality only ever exists within the infinite now, within these slivers of time, and that we are constantly dead and reborn every moment. And so life can only
Exactly.
ever exist in this infinite now, this extended liminality of the bardo, right? Anyway.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. For Artaud, this other is no more than what all the others are who have always wanted a finger in every person's consciousness. Artaud continues, we're at the bottom here. They speak on their own behalf, but the imbecilic rites of the lamas complete their influences, because the beasts are bad spirits, but the priests are bad beasts. Which is to say that life and death are to be resumed on other grounds, and that this is the problem against which I have ceaselessly fought in silence since I first thought of the theater of cruelty. There are on the earth too many ritual crimes, yogis, lamas, masses, incantations, sacrifices, sacred or not sacred, but still ritualized, for the people to live in peace.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that statement. There is so much propaganda, and propaganda is no different from magic. It's a form of
True,
magic, right? And you just got
definitely.
to see all of the weaponized, imagery and symbolism and lies to recognize it. Yeah.
Totally. Artaud feared any influence from the other which could manifest itself in language, culture, or religion as ideas or concepts which he thought of as beings. For Artaud, bardo was a state of existence that produces life and death. Artaud believes that the concept of life and death, such as these ideas are presently understood in this world, leads to the thought of a cyclical return from which is born the idea of an intermediate stage. For Tibetan Buddhists, this stage is relegated not only to life after death, but also to life as it is lived in the present moment. But for Artaud, this is a false construct which only benefits the spirit world by giving them a space to incarnate. Ultimately, they are able to inhabit this fake realm because it exists in the human mind. For Artaud, the intermediate stage is nothing but a kind of limbo wherein the body is subject to auditory and visual hallucinations. They are caused by the implantation of the very idea of life, which is the costume that was grafted upon the body.
Wow, that's so. Reading all this, I wonder if Artaud was aware of the writings of Max Stirner. Is he influenced by this idea of the spook? I mean, I know that Max Stirner is also coming from an occulted background, but a lot, but you could both of them are moving out of the occulted realms and then into the realm of ideas, and they're seeing the
Right.
ideas and the ghosts as one and the same, right? Whether they're spirits of the ancestors or they're spirits of law and culture and other things that seek to control us is beyond the point. It's
Totally, totally.
interesting though.
Love it. For Artaud, the idea of existence is a lie. Being a lie, man is a lie, a baller of swine, a swine of balls. Beings have invented life and grafted it onto the dead tree, which was all there was. Here Artaud alludes to the tree of knowledge, but this dead tree is also Artaud himself, a name for the body. Life itself was an enemy to the dead man in the bardo because the spirits attempted to force a rebirth so they could drain the energy from the body. We recall that this is involved. We recall that this involved the spirits separating the consciousness of the dead man and assuming it for themselves as a way to incarnate. For Artaud, the tree of knowledge of good and evil was all there was before the insurrection against God and the consequent flooding of the world with guilt, whose basis was recognition of the separateness of the physical body from God. Thus, the
Wow.
body for Artaud was degraded and became ashamed of itself, a lower form of matter, a sub-element. From male and female are born the recognition of good and evil. Artaud writes concerning this degraded body. I was an old carved up tree who didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't breathe. But those snot, feces, and jism diarrhea brotherhoods insinuated themselves in me, enveloping my least firmament, and setting up for themselves a sub-elemental cesspool of life, a perjured double of life. Artaud was
Wow.
concerned rather with the sub-element, and above all the body without organs. There was a time when man did not die, and that was not the terrestrial paradise, but the life of present history. And until the year 1000, there were so people across the earth who had never died for centuries since they were born, and that the churches hunted everywhere so that they decided at last to disappear. That is how there were before the year 1000 villages of the living dead that the living could not stand because they knew more than everyone else.
Oh, wow. This
Golden
stuff is
age of
wild here, right?
humanity.
The degradation of the primordial human into the male and the female is the beginning of the descent into good and evil, into this duality and into this war, right? Into violence and
Exactly.
wow, 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 wow. There's some real wildness going on here, you
Oh,
know?
I know. Kind of like how the humans at first were androgynous and they didn't die, right? And they were separated.
Exactly. This is a classic
So
story,
they can't understand themselves, and then they can't overthrow the tyrant.
right? What Grandma's alluding here to is in some of the tellings of the story of Prometheus. Prometheus is the one who creates humanity. He originally creates humanity as a bigendered being that are attached at the back. And Zeus, when he sees this bigendered being, he recognizes that its potential to become like him. And so he divides them, separates them into male and female as a way to prevent them from achieving his empowered uniqueness, by keeping them at
Exactly.
war between themselves, keeping them separate as male and female. They
Literal,
can't rise to be gods.
literal divide and conquer.
Literal divide and conquer, right? We were created beautiful in the image of Prometheus, right? Of Promethea, and Zeus shattered that image for the sake of his own power.
Yeah,
At least in one telling, right? This is the thing also.
yeah.
There are many
It's one of my
tellings of these
favorite.
stories,
It's
right?
one of my favorite versions of the story, though. It's always
Yeah,
stuck with
it's a
me.
good one. It's a good one.
At the
Okay,
bottom here,
okay.
Artaud
Continue.
here alludes to a time when men did not die. More importantly, the church was responsible for the eradication of these. Um, I cut off part of it. Sorry.
Mhm. That's okay.
It's not, and if not in another life on earth karmically determined, then in a new life, the eternal paradise or the infernal depths of hell. Artaud describes the fall of this virgin state. It happens that one day where I was at and the way I was no longer virgin, nor intact, nor free, nor alone, nor at the beginning, nor the beginning itself. For Artaud is the living dead that possess knowledge of the tree. For him they knew more than those who are merely alive, and for this reason the living are envious of them. Artaud explains how this came about. Death is an intrinsic energy, a state that makes a being that has reached it crumble. Life is not an energy, but the loss of that energy which one day wanted to establish itself in the place of a fleeting death. And it stole from death something to establish itself in its void, something it then set in the sap and breath of its living beings. Life is not an energy, it is the loss of that destructive energy which is death. Life wanted to establish itself in the place of death, which is insubstantial and fleeting. As a
You know what?
result, life's. Hmm?
Let's just pause here. So much of this reminds me of the story of the Kori, right? And this place of the divine virgin within the Greco-Roman tradition, because the virgin, right? This is Aphrodite Urania, that perfected idealistic love that exists beyond matter in that absolute perfected realm of ideas, right? So this is that virginal cosmic force that is pure in absolute beauty, untainted by hate and anger and the filth of the world. And so there's this whole thing, especially within many of these various forms of Platonism and Neoplatonism, where you're trying to return to that purity of Aphrodite. And we see this on full display in the story of the Kori of Persephone, right? Persephone represents the pure virgin embodiment of spring, right? Who is what? Played with by the gods. The gods, Zeus, he objectifies her and gives her to his brother, who then takes her into hell, right? Takes her into the underworld, corrupts her in the earth. And it's there that she becomes the queen of the dead. But it is through her own struggle in the earth, right? In her story as the Virgo, that eventually she's able to rise and return. Also through the power of her mother, Demeter, and the intermediary gods like Hecate and Helios, right? But these forces help that Corey then go through these cycles to return back to the one. And again, the story of Persephone is mirroring the story of Attis. These are two different stories within the same tradition that are telling you the same exact thing, but from slightly different perspectives. In one, you have the feminine that's abducted and abused and degraded. And the other, you have the masculine that falls prey. But both of these wind up doing what? Returning back to that divine androgyne chaos at the beginning, going through these cycles of death and rebirth to return to that great mother, to become that great mother reborn, right?
Beautiful, beautiful.
So much of what Artaud is saying directly parallels this kind of idea of this pure virgin force that is unadulterated by, by all of that filth of sex and violence, right? And we see this, like, I want people to understand how intrinsic this is to the Western magical tradition, and that Artaud is not an outlier, even though, within modern occultism, this kind of idea is not as popular now,
Right. So we're at the bottom here. Life is not an energy. It is the loss of that destructive energy, which is death. Life wanted to establish itself in the place of death, which is insubstantial and fleeting. As a result, life stole something from it, is judged, invaded, and potentially transformed against its will into an animal spirit.
Into an animal
Above,
spirit, just like Persephone,
yeah,
right?
totally. Above all, for Artaud, this god that has persisted through history is a fate. The only question is that of having a body, of having oneself with enough body to tear one's strength loose from other beings who have stolen it. I speak for myself. I'm answerable to no one in the organization. Get back down in your grave, God, you low-down corpse. The body that the body that has evolved through time and suffered ceaseless persecutions both in life and in the afterlife is a corrupt body born of the Spirit of God. Thus, God is one of Artaud's greatest enemies. For Artaud, God is an idea that was corrupt from the beginning of recorded history. In his letter to Colette Thomas, March 27, 1946, Artaud gives his version of a time before the invention of what he calls a recent idea of God. This earth had already existed for millions of years, experienced not by beasts, but by true men who, besides, even before God, were not worth much. So where did things come from? Not from God, but from man, always dead and always alive. Thus, Artaud calls for a reconstruction of the anatomy of man, one that will lead to the absolute autonomy of the body and a new concept of life that is defiant even in death. He writes, no mouth, no tongue, no teeth, no larynx, no esophagus, no stomach, no guts, no anus. I will construct the man that I am. This is the pure nothing, the uncreated that is not reborn but infinite and evolved from beginning to end. It is the body without organs.
Wow. The body beyond form, right? Returning back to the uncreated, unthinkable form, beyond
Not
form,
reborn but infinite.
right? Not reborn, but infinite. Returning back to that infinite nothing, But this is interesting because for Artaud, right, it's so similar to the Buddhists, but then so radically
Not,
non-Buddhist at the
yeah,
same
yeah.
time. Because, right, like ultimately you can perceive this as a similar idea to nirvana, right? By returning back to that primordial infinity, are you not blowing out the light? But he's radically rejecting that idea at the same time.
Yeah, he's full of contradictions and doubles.
But this is why it's so beautiful. It's not so much a
Mhm.
contradiction, it's a, you know
Yeah, not a
it's
contradiction, but different sides of the same coin.
different sides of the same coin. Exactly, right? Different perceptions of what that enlightenment truly could mean, or that extinguishing truly means.
Totally.
Wow.
So now we come to the incestuous father and his daughters of the heart. I'll just read from the back here. This explores Artaud's relation to the various women in his life. To these women, Artaud was a force, alternately sympathetic and cruel, manipulative and romantic. And
Yeah,
I
so
just
we have
focused.
to give a bit of a trigger warning here. You know, we love Artaud, but Artaud is human, and this is where he kind
Kind of
of,
an asshole.
you know, this is where we're
Kind of
going to
an
be digging
asshole.
in. Yeah, we're going to be digging into some filth, right? But we got to take
Yeah, it's
Artaud as he
not
was.
too not too degrading, but it's just like, yeah, you'll see. I only focused
Yeah.
on his letters to Colette Thomas in this section. I didn't go through all of them.
Okay. But yeah,
So
we'll
let's
just
go.
say that his relation with women is complicated at best.
Yeah, for sure. What emerges in Artaud's later letters are the various roles he embodied when corresponding with certain women who belonged to his inner circle of friends. In the letters to Colette Thomas, he is a sympathetic father figure who is both a teacher and a kind of moralist. When writing to Marthe Robert, he is the brother of a friendly confidant, expressing his anger and anguish and despair, recounting for his early love for Annie Bernard that's transformed over the years into something sinister. He also encourages Martha as a writer. Finally, there were the letters to Annie Bernard that reveal a romantic strain in Artaud. He recalls her previous love, which he now sees as having been hopelessly deficient because of her marriage. He speaks of dissimulation and betrayal, and from this emerges the idea of Annie's double. In fact, there's a kind of doubling effect that occurs in Artaud when corresponding with these women. His relationship with Colette Thomas ends tragically with her eventual mental collapse. He tries to manipulate Martha Robert into obtaining drugs for him. The letters to Annie Bernard are once romantic and, as suggested above, deeply embittered. I'll examine this essay in one letter written from each of these women to show the various roles embodied with this new family of the daughters of the heart yet unborn. So, daughters of the heart yet unborn. This is he's talking about becoming the self procreating father figure, and he
Right.
reimagines women in his life as being like his daughters that he's like given birth to. So, Henri Thomas, the young novelist who had been corresponding with Artaud about an article he was writing on the theater and its double, came to visit Artaud at Rodez on March 10th, 1946, and brought his young wife, Colette Thomas, who was already an aspiring actress. Artaud was very happy with this visit and read them poems of Gerard de Nerval, another important writer. Stephen Barber writes, Artaud was attracted to Colette Thomas, whose marriage was breaking down. His preoccupations with her would extend beyond the time of his internment. For Artaud, she seemed to embody his new life and coming liberation. Though his health had been shattered by the asylums and electroshocks, Artaud believed he could still be resuscitated with the help of immortal young girls such as Colette Thomas. He began to incorporate her into his Daughters of the Heart. Colette herself had been interned in a mental hospital during her student years when she had been placed in a straitjacket and given cardiazol, a seizure-provoking drug generally administered as a prelude to electroshock. So she's, they're coming from a similar shared pain.
Right.
Artaud writes in
Right.
a letter to her written on April 3rd, the story of the asylum, of the treatments and the cardiazol, suffocates suffocates me when I think of it because it strangely resembles all the stories I experienced since the age of puberty in 1914. Artaud clearly had sympathy for her. She was only 23 years old when they met. They often wrote letters to each other during this time, and Colette incorporated fragments of these letters in her only book, The Testament of the Dead Daughter, published in 1954. But her devotion to Artaud led to an over-identification with him and his writings, which became intense and obsessive. She wrote, if you do not want me to be one of your actresses, I will be one of your soldiers. If you do not want me to be one of your soldiers, I will be one of your daughters. If you do not want me to be one of your daughters, I will be your unique daughter. It was she herself who delivered a reading of the text from Artaud's Fragmentations in June 1946 during a benefit forum in Paris. Despite her anxiety and terror, she performed them with an intense enthusiasm, even during a power outage, and to great applause. She also read another of Artaud's texts called Alienate the Actor for the exhibition of his drawings at the Galerie Pierre, which opened on July 4th, 1947. She had not rehearsed the reading with Artaud and was in a highly strained state at the event. Jacques Prevel was present and described what he saw. The crowd was dense, I could hardly move, and the heat was overwhelming. Colette Thomas was horribly nervous with an unbearable stage fright. She began as though she had been thrown into water and never managed to take control of herself in an instant. It was at once pathetic and extremely painful. Jacques Prevel is kind of an asshole, if you
Wow.
can't tell.
Yeah.
But but Colette, but Colette redeemed herself on another occasion for the exhibition on July 18th. About this reading, Prevel writes, there were lots of people. It was stifling. Artaud spoke first with great rigor of meaning, absolutely opposite of his lecture. Then Colette Thomas extraordinary, as Artaud expressed it, like a mind ready to materialize.
Oh
Artaud
wow.
continued to see her during the autumn of 1947, but she was becoming more estranged from him as he began to declare that she believed he had written her texts, that he had stolen them from her. He also claimed that she wanted to seduce him in order to have a baby. So hard to know what's real here and what's not. He also
Hmm.
claimed that she wanted to seduce him in order to have a baby. She refused to participate in a reading of his texts in November. This angered him, who felt it was simply a gratuitous caprice on her part. But it was becoming clear to the people in Artaud's inner circle that her mental state was deteriorating under actual or imagined pressures. Her mental condition deteriorated in later years until she was in a state of total bewilderment and amnesia and unable to remember Artaud. She spent the remainder of her life in private clinics. Though she may have felt rejected by Artaud, and it is true that Artaud was excessively demanding and cruel at times, it is also a fact that she suffered largely because of an over-identification with him and his work. As a result, she suffered the imaginary and, in a sense for her, very real death of a true daughter of the heart. In the letter to her of April 3rd, Artaud writes, "Your letter has touched my heart as few letters have in all my life, because I see that your soul, like mine, was not troubled, because one feels in your depths the black light of a terrifying consciousness and a terrifying lucidity in the midst of a chaos not your own, but of things coming at you. Your soul is not troubled then, but monstrously scandalized." What a young woman who had herself struggled with asylum treatment and hospitalization would have thought of this, we do not know, since we don't have her letters. But her mental condition would have made her feel like an outsider. As an aspiring actress, she would identify with inhabiting a self other than her own. Given her fragile mental state, his extraordinary presence initiated in her a terror and an amazement that overwhelmed her. Artaud emphasized this in order to comfort her as a kind of authoritative father figure, that her soul is not troubled but monstrously scandalized, and that she is in possession of a terrifying lucidity. And he emphasized that her soul has been troubled like mine. He draws her into this identification as an outsider. He continues, "Yes, Colette, I am in this world, as you say. I am certainly here, and so are you, and I have no intention of ever leaving. But, and this should not seem like pride to you, but it is the world that will go away."
Oh
This is an
wow.
example of his romantic sensibility, but I am not suggesting that Artaud consciously attempted to seduce Colette. She appeared before him as a young, attractive woman with an interest in the theater. At this time, Artaud was toothless and his health shattered by electroshock during his time in the asylum, but he was still alive in the face of ill will and the great collective forgetting of him. Finally, he writes, "You too, Colette Thomas, are a poor girl martyrized over the centuries, who the priests have never left alone because you are a great soul and a great being. I have always been martyrized for being always in revolt, first against God, first against the idea of God, second against the idea of the universal spirit of beings, and third, because of the way in my breath that everyone has tried to take away from me. The weapon of my breath that everyone has tried to take away from me, because you too, Colette Thomas, by spitting all your breath onto the guilty conscience, you can impose silence on legions of evil beings. Not everyone can do this, but you are one of the rare few that can, and the nuns who martyrized you knew it when you didn't quite know it yet, but they were duplicitous enough not to tell you anything in order to avoid awakening your consciousness on this point.
Wow.
So he's recognizing that the weapon of his breath, the power of incantation, and he's recognizing this power in her as well, and that's why she was subjected to cardiazol.
But this is also like this is so dangerous, Arto, right?
Very, very.
You're transforming he's transforming himself into this young girl's mind as this father figure guru, and is feeding into her delusional psychosis.
It's true. It's very true. It's not
I know
healthy
he
at
has the
all.
best
This
of
is
intentions, but it just needs to be
it's
acknowledged.
oh 100% is totally would damage her sense of self identity.
Right.
The nuns and priests might as well have been the doctors and nurses in the mental hospital at Cannes. The world he envisions here is the terrible one that silences man in order to avoid awakening in him the consciousness, the terrible lucidity that he spoke of earlier in the letter. Colette must have agreed with him and also seen herself the ways in which a Catholic conception of good and evil represses the individual. Thus, Colette is given a privileged status in Artaud's world, and so the young married woman rebels against submission to her husband. In an interview with Henri Thomas, late 90s, he speaks of her cruelty to him during this time. Artaud ends the letter with an intimate salutation. "My heart will always be with you." And he adds, "P.S. It will be a great joy for me to receive the texts you speak of. I await them." These are probably the texts that would eventually become her Colette's book, The Testament of the Dead Daughter. Artaud is happy that this young girl expressed an interest in him, and as a result, he is generous. But as much as this was instinctive sympathetic response in Artaud, it was also not to be taken, as presumably Colette did, to heart. The idea of the daughters of the heart fulfilled the requirement in Artaud's fantasy worlds of resurrecting him from the dead in order to enact revenge on a world that cruelly misunderstood and mistreated him. If not Colette, another daughter would have suited Artaud's fantasy. Colette made the mistake of assuming that she was herself of crucial importance in his life. Perhaps she was in a sense, since she read his texts and radiated a youthful enthusiasm in his company. But Steve Barber writes, in his Artaud's perception, Colette Thomas had already been divided between a double who existed and whom he had met in his life, and a true Colette who was yet to appear. Colette could not have understood the real essence of the ideas in these letters and their importance for him. When Artaud speaks of being silenced, he's referring to something much darker than she could have surmised by his language. In the letter to Colette Thomas written on March 27th, 1946 from Espalion, Artaud writes, "There is in my life a dark thing one cannot speak of without being considered insane, and that is the crime. Artaud's desire is forbidden because essentially the object of it is a mirror of himself, for which the incestuous relation so conceived by him is a substitute. So his love is also the incestuous love of a father for his daughter. Artaud was
Oh,
certainly attracted to Colette, but he reacts violently when he believes she wants to have his baby. She's one of Proust's budding young girls. To conceive of Artaud's romanticism as a heterosexual longing for Colette would be inaccurate. Indeed, when the male is aroused in him by imagining that this beautiful young woman would like to have his child, an alternate feminine is aroused and rejects this possibility. In this way, the virgin is never violated and his strength is never diminished. The virgin is the androgynous god, the bornless one, clean and pure. Artaud writes, "We are not yet born. We are not yet of this world. There is no world yet. Things have not been created. The raison d'etre are not found. The only question is that of having a body, of having with oneself enough body to tear one's strength loose from other beings who have stolen it."
so let's
This,
pause here because I think this is really interesting that Peter Valente uses this word, this phrase here, the bornless one. So
yeah,
for those who are deep into the occult magical world, this is a very, very important magical phrase that comes to us from the Greek magical papyri, specifically from a portion of the Greek magical papyri known as the Stela of Jeu, Jeu. And on that, you have the right to the headless or to the bornless one. Now, the bornless one is a interpretation of this ritual done within the Golden Dawn magical tradition, and
oh
several
wow,
people have attributed and done or played with this rite. Crowley does a version of this rite where he calls it the bornless one, but it's this magical rite in which you identify with this headless deity, the hidden god, and you go through this process of destroying the self and then being, like to kill your ego is to go back, right? The bornless, this what's so wild is that Crowley, when he read this rite on the Stele of Jeu, he interpreted it in this image of the headless god as returning back to a time before creation, right? Of becoming the bornless one. So that's clearly what Valente is trying to connect
oh
Artaud
definitely,
to this Greek magical idea, this Crowleyan idea of the headless, bornless, hidden god again. All right.
exactly. Thanks for expanding on that. This echoes Artaud's reproach to Colette that marked the beginning of her decline into madness, and this is the beginning of the tragedy of her coming into contact with Artaud. So
Wow.
now we come to the last portion of the novel of the book, the Jesus staff of Antonin Artaud. Let's
Wow.
dive in. This gets
So
pretty wild,
the
wild stuff
Jesus
here.
staff, right? We've talked. This is kind of, you know, this is something that's truly infamous about Artaud because this really solidifies his sort of magical image, right? In his apocalyptic moment when he goes to Ireland, he was seen walking around with
He
this
was
Jesus.
he was gift he was gifted a cane and told it was the cane of Saint Patrick, which is
Yeah,
why he went to Dublin or to Ireland.
exactly. This begins his sort of apocalyptic journey, but he would go around with this staff and he had metal clasps on either end and would strike the ground.
He had the tip covered in smelted, and he would strike it, and he says that it would make flames, but everyone and people were too afraid to admit it.
But
So,
it
yeah.
probably sparked it, or at least it made a
Oh,
loud
for sure,
noise,
it made sparks.
right?
Yeah, yeah, or
Yeah.
sound.
But
Yeah, so they
it's
get
very
into
go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say they get into the actual history of
Within
it in this essay.
Oh, so this will be good. And there's a lot of I wonder, there's been looking online, there's a lot of speculation about what happened to his staff.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
had
One
two
per
of them.
yeah, yeah. He says in here that there were multiples, and that yeah. Okay, I don't want to spoil it.
Okay, we'll get
In a
into it.
letter
So,
in a letter of 1937 to Anne Masson, Artaud writes, "Pushed by gigantic forces, I finished by discovering who I am and by accepting what I am." At the time of this letter, he is about to engage in a series of provocations involving a magical cane which he believed the staff of St. Patrick in Dublin, his last stop in a journey that began in Mexico in 1936. The journey culminated in Artaud's arrest and deportation to France in a straitjacket. This was the beginning of what would amount to 9 years of incarceration and asylums. Stephen Barber writes about these series of journeys undertaken by Artaud from 1937, which we talked about in another channel, in another episode.
right.
You should go watch it.
We have his journals from that period and stuff.
1937 Apocalypse.
Yeah.
They were impelled by Artaud's constant yearning for a wild apocalyptic force, which would violently erase his humiliating experiences in the Parisian theater, thereby resuscitating his dreams and his life. By January 1936, Artaud's association with the Surrealists in the Alfred Jarry Theater was a complete collapse. His production of the Cenci a failure, commercial failure, I would say. Not
Right.
we see ripples of its influence today in a lot of modern stuff, but at the time, it was commercially
Right.
successful. His acting career almost non-existent, and his work rejected by the Parisian literary circles. He could no longer tolerate collaboration of any kind. He now conceived of this theater of cruelty in terms of dramatic action that would have far-reaching consequences for man and the world. By the time he reached Dublin in September, his religious preoccupations were increasingly becoming violent. He now imagined himself as the enraged Christ who wielded his cane and who would order the execution of the Pope. Artaud believed the cane would bring a final end to the world. His command of such ultimate devastation would give him the authority to speak in the voice of God. In Dublin, there were several altercations with police, and Artaud incited the people to support him. Artaud writes in numerous letters of a beating he received during one of these altercations. He also remembered striking a police officer with his cane. Initially, Artaud managed to escape arrest, but on September 20th, he's evicted from his boarding house for non-payment and attempts refuge at a Jesuit college. When he's refused, he begins to shout and scream. The police arrives, and fighting ensues. The cane disappears. Abruptly, the letters stop coming. On September 23rd, he's arrested for vagrancy and is brought to Montjoie prison in Ireland. He's then deported to France. At the port of the Havre on September 13th, 1937, he's placed in a straitjacket. Artaud first learned about the Jesus staff of St. Patrick in 1934. He writes about this experience in terms of a false prophecy in a letter to Madame Jean Dubuffet, written on November 29th, 1945, in Rodez. My story is not that of the prophecy of St. Patrick, which you know, since you read it in the Dictionary of Hagiography, published in 1894, of which there was a copy in 1934, the date when I first read the prophecy, on the shelves of the public room of the National Library. My story is therefore not that of this prophecy, which in 1894, 2 years before I was born, contained sections of verses from the Umbilicus of Limbo, which is the second book, published in 1925, but another story that tries by any means to escape from that of the prophecy which before my birth read my verses in my stillborn head.
Oh, wow.
So he frequently talks about having past lives. This is so he's talking about here that and like people from the past stealing writings that he wrote in the future, and sort of like yeah,
Right.
blurring the line between his myth and others' myths.
Interesting.
According to the legend, the Bacal Isu, or staff of Jesus, was given to St. Patrick by a hermit who had received it from Jesus Christ on an island in the Etruscan Sea. Among its many wonders and miracles was the ability to cause catastrophe and plague if one swore falsely upon it in a legal manner. Artaud was referring to the prophecy of St. Patrick, which foretold of a terrible deluge that would cause Ireland to suffer 7 years before the end of the world. The people of Ireland would then be spared the reign of the Antichrist. Artaud distinguishes himself from the official prophecy of St. Patrick, published in 1894, and also claimed that this prophecy contains his writings inside his stillborn head. This suggests that the coma Artaud suffered under electroshock is a kind of death, and also that another being in the bardo usurps his consciousness and writes his words. He says the story of his life has been one that tries by any means to escape from that of the prophecy of Ireland's suffering. His writings, like his life, are not predestined but immediate and actual, and not to be poked at and pinched in advance by I know not what criminal spirit of the past and my present. He was given a cane in 1937 upon release from a drug detox center and believed it to be the staff of St. Patrick. His extravagant displays with this cane on the Paris streets ruined his chances for marriage, since his fiance's parents were scandalized. He eventually had the cane steel tipped and dipped in holy water and took it to Ireland. 9 years
Wow.
later, in a letter to Madame Jean Dubuffet, Artaud mentions the cane again. In Artaud's world, it has become to represent a weapon of great power against all that is against him and would attempt to influence him. In the letter, he speaks of a new cane that he has created to engage in battle against those hateful dissociative maneuvers of the people of Paris and other cities in France that are committed under the protection of the police. He writes that this abominable state of affairs must cease. For if, as you know, I am full of hatred for Jesus Christ, I am equally full of hatred for the Antichrist, who is never more than his minion and an object of his bewitchment. I went to Mexico to the summit of a mountain more than 5,000 meters high to put a stop to a certain Christ-like maneuvers of white magic from which all black magic was always fomented, both directly by the spirit of contradiction and also by another spirit that never tolerated the white.
I just love that idea that Artaud immediately recognizes the Antichrist is just more Christian nonsense. It's like,
Oh yeah,
the reason why a lot of us reject Satanism. You're still caught up in that myth. If you're anti everything that Christianity is, then you're still defined by that tradition.
exactly.
You're not moving beyond it at all.
Which is mirrored in his criticism of cubism. It's like
Right, right. Just
they
as
talk about
cubism doesn't move
abstraction.
beyond the world, right?
Yeah,
Wow,
excuse me.
beautiful.
Pretty wild. Let's go to the next page.
Yeah.
He alludes to the time spent among the Tarahumara Indians in Mexico in 1936 and characterizes this journey in retrospect as having been an attempt to stop certain Christ-like maneuvers of white magic, from which is fomented the opposite, black magic. Christ is indistinguishable from Satan, which is described as that spirit that never tolerated the white. It is this spirit of contradiction that Artaud believes allows the people to manipulate and simulate the good while committing hateful acts against him. For this reason, he must reject both Christ and the Antichrist. In this letter, Artaud also speaks of an impending journey to Tibet and mentions that the cane. I need a cane that I expressly prepared for this purpose and whose failed prototype is the cane of St. Patrick, with which I made my journey to Ireland, which is now in the hands of the so-called Annie Bernard at 45K Bourbon. The Annie Bernard that lives at 45K Bourbon is in fact a double. The real Annie was intercepted on a journey to meet Artaud and assassinated. Artaud writes that the reason for this was that she was suspected of wanting to return the cane to me on one day, the famous cane that left in Dublin in September 1937. It is this double that is in possession of a cane that Artaud, in any case, calls a failed prototype. It is a double of the real cane. In this letter, the real cane represents a kind of magical weapon with which Artaud will complete the dreadful work in Tibet of abolishing the spirit of contradiction that rules Western mind and where, in the name of reason, those hateful crimes are committed.
So interesting. I just want to take a moment to talk for a second about the cane within the occult magical tradition, because it's such an important symbol, right? And
Right.
this is something that deep important significance within the Greek religion, right? We would have in the Roman religion, you have the various prophets and the various people who were interpreting the future would use the canes, the augurs, right? The people who would watch the birds. And we even see this within the Catholic Church to this day. They're still using these augur staffs of ancient Rome. You know,
Yeah.
we also
Even the story of Moses with his staff and the
exactly.
staff of
Well, it's
the
the
Egyptian
story.
priest.
We got to be careful because it's not the staff of Moses; it's the staff of
No.
Aaron, right? And
Yes. Yes. Yes.
what's interesting about that too is that we have a continuation here because Aaron does what with the staff? He commands the snakes and he parts the sea. What does St. Patrick do in his stories? He commands the snakes and parts the seas, right? That's how he defeats the Druids in his battle with them. He gets rid of all the snakes in Ireland and he uses the magic to handle the water to prevent the flames from burning him. Very similar ideas is this idea that this magic staff, right, it has the power to command the elements as well as the animals. Interesting stuff.
Exactly. And at the very bottom, Artaud continues his letter to Madame Jean Dubuffet by speaking of the need for assistance. He writes, "My own consciousness will not sink, but I cannot defend the consciousness of my friends based on the duration and integrity of my
Oh, sorry.
next slide. No worries. My own mind, if my friends do not resolve to understand that it is urgent for them to bring me some assistance, not in the everyday sense, that is to say, in the sense of a poet who is committed and then granted liberty, but who does not have the financial means to live in the outside world or the circle of relations needed to care for him, but rather in a sense it is against everyday life. That is to say, like a voyager of infinite irritation towards monstrosity of this earth, and who, just as he went to Mexico to silence the old sorcerers, was to go to Tibet to grab those black magicians, the lamas by the throat, and on the way to blow up St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and even more of the basilicas of St. John Lateran.
Wow, he wants
Artaud's,
to break these basilicas. I love it.
yeah,
Right?
destroy
Well,
the Pope.
necromantic centers, right? What is a basilica? Basilica is important because they often would hold, an artifacts of the saints, and
Mhm,
they're connected to the saints, Saint Peter in Rome, right? This is really heavy, heavy stuff. You know,
totally. Artaud is
Beautiful.
not speaking of assistance in the everyday sense, for example, by financially helping a man who has been released from incarceration and now needs the support of friends and a place to go. In fact, the assistance he needs is against everyday life. He refers to his time in Mexico among the Tarahumara Indians when he was in search of the transformative properties of peyote and a new life through magic ritual. It was a journey that proved crucial in determining the course of the next 9 years of his life. His failed attempts to enact his theories about the theater in reality culminated in this journey of 1936-1937, the result of which was a monumental, almost apocalyptic annihilation of the self. At the time of this letter, 10 years later, after having undergone multiple electroshocks, suffered daily abuses, starvation, and terror, his anger, the anger of the furious Christ that he embodied in 1936 as revealed, has arisen with the confidence and rage, with the desire to blow up St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and even more the Basilica of St. John Lateran. He continues, "I have prepared a cane for this purpose, which is in the hands of my daughter Catherine Chile, who you saw from afar defending me yesterday, Thursday, November 29th, all day long. And you and John Dubuffet have also struggled with me, and have even told me as I was sitting at the table."
Okay,
Next
sorry.
slide, sorry. I was sitting at the table at 6 in the evening, and you were both feeling asphyxiated, hollowed in the bone and in the sex, raped in the throat by the organ of evil. You spoke to me as the loving souls of friends and close relations who trust me completely and come to ask for my support. But what is the matter, Mr. Artaud? I made two signs to help you with my breath in my hand like two lilac arched racks in my body between my shoulder blades and my thorax. I think this must have given you relief. Yourself, Jean Dubuffet, René de Solier, and Henri Passot. Artaud says that the cane he needs to complete his work is in the hands of Catherine Chile. She's one of the daughters of the heart. Here she defends him by using a cane. In the letter to Henri Thomas of March 13th, 1946, from Rodez, Artaud writes about another daughter of the heart. I had entrusted one of these canes to a Mademoiselle Seguin, who must be 45 or 46 years old now, and who had published some poems in 1935 in the Nouvelle Revue Française. I don't even know which issue. I don't know under what name. Perhaps it was that of Catherine Chile. I believe she became a doctor of medicine in 37 or 38. Here Artaud suggests that the name is an alias for Mademoiselle Seguin. He writes that she became a doctor of medicine in 1937 or 1938. In Artaud's fantasy, there are doubles and aliases. For Artaud, nothing in this world is what it seems to be. Artaud tells of another incident involving Jean Dubuffet and his wife. He speaks of asphyxiation, of being hollowed in the bone and the sex, and raped in the throat by the organ of evil. This organ, the tongue, also aids in the perpetuation of language that Artaud is always regarded as suspect, as shit. The hollow bone may be a reference to the feeling of the body undergoing electroshock. The hollow sex is a reference to the invasion of beings to the genital region, particularly the anus. Of course, in his letter, Artaud transfers his own persecution upon Jean and his wife. Thus, he enacts a kind of banishing ritual involving the breath and the hands that are like two lilac arched racks in my body between my shoulder blades and my thorax.
Wow.
The image above resembles part of a machine. Stephen Barber writes, "The machine appeals to Artaud because of its instantaneity with which it generates objects or images, and oblivion to the mental, sensory, or social processes that he distrusts. The body is transformed with the use of the hand and its gestural power, in alignment with the breath, that create a machine of instant utility with which Artaud attacks his enemies. Here the cane is imagined as a kind of telepathic transmitter between Catherine and Artaud, a force field that creates a corporeal transformation and initiates a desired attack against the others, the malignant spirits, including the doctors who persecuted him.
I love that. Right? Wow. Artaud's such a
Artaud's
wild man. Using
Oh,
the
I know.
weapons of the Magus to defend and to fight against the black magicians. This is another thing that connects him to Crowley that I think that Peter Valente must have noticed, because Crowley is always talking about the black and white lodges too, right? And is engaged in this kind of this cosmic warfare as well, right? This is something you see in much of the occult world, right?
Yeah, when he's referring to like this new staff, it reminds me in the Sinister Assassin by Stephen Barber. He describes that um, while in the convalescence clinic after the asylums, the coordinator of the facility set up a large wooden block that he could hit while he was reciting his glossolalia and his writing, and he would strike it with a staff that they say was crafted in the shape of a serpent.
Oh, he's got a
And
serpent staff.
I can't help but think this is the staff that he was going to bring, because it's shortly after this he dies, but he was talking about traveling to Tibet with the staff.
Right.
So I'm thinking that was the real staff. And the staff of St. Patrick was what he calls a failed prototype.
Right.
Pretty interesting. That's just my own inference. It's not like, I don't know if that's actually true, but he has the staff shaped like a serpent that is described. So I don't know.
That's
Anyways,
cool. It's interesting.
Artaud's fate was largely the result of Parisian society's rejection of anything that did not conform to normal accepted behavior. Artaud's poverty kept him on the margins of acceptable society. A number of times in his travels, he found himself back in his mother's apartment, lacking the funds to continue. And he was addicted to harmful drugs, which ruined his chances of maintaining a relationship with the women in his life, such as Jenica Athanasiou, who left him in 1928. In a letter written to Henri Thomas from Rodez on March 13th, 1946, Artaud recalls the beginning of his incarceration and writes that nevertheless, 9 years of solitude and horror were useful to me. And yet he continues, but I could have avoided them, and I think things would have not fallen where they did if they had left me alone and been willing to understand me in Ireland when I went to present my cane of action to the Irish. Yet by the time of this letter to Thomas, the past no longer concerns Artaud. He is about to create a volume of work that far surpasses in sheer length and extremity all his previous work. Which is true. He wrote more in the last year and a half of his life than his entire life leading up to the asylums.
That's kind of wild.
Pretty wild. Over thousands of pages. So he had rebuilt his life, and in this letter he speaks in a prophetic voice, marking the year 1937, the beginning of his incarceration in various asylums, as the beginnings of catastrophes on Earth. There have been since 1937 how many wars, famines, epidemics, quota systems, rationings, exterminations, concentration and death camps in Soviet Russia or Germany. And today, and since 1937, where are theater, literature, poetry, painting, etc.? The world is buggering off into the nothingness that will swallow it like the old uterus of mothers or the tarot fibrous anus of fathers, who at this time and since the beginning of things will never give it back.
Wow.
Artaud has rejuvenated the prophetic tone of the New Revelations of Being, written in 1937, where he was insisting on a reclassing of all values that would be fundamental, absolute. Next page, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamental, absolute. The old cane is no longer useful to Artaud and it belongs to the past. But Artaud writes that he has planted 2 or 3 others, where he wants to put his whole idea of theater and poetry. The cane is organic and magical, and capable of reproducing itself like a plant in nature. Furthermore, it is a repository for Artaud's ideas on poetry and the theater. It is also a phallic symbol. Aidan Matthews in St. Artaud writes that Artaud traveled to Ireland in search of a sacred phallus, St. Patrick's staff, that would finally and forever liberate him from the travails of his own sexuality. Artaud hopes with this cane to be able to give all who have been willing to do him the honor of listening to him hearing him the space to breathe in this asphyxiating world by a projection of his breath. Here once again the breath was a magical force and an attack on the malignant spirits that tormented Artaud.
I wonder how deep Artaud gets into some of this Greco-Roman stuff, because the search for the phallus is another magical thing, right? Like, for example, we have all of these deities with the exaggerated phalluses who are these gods of fertility and connected to the Great Mother. One of the most famous is that god Priapus, Priapus,
Yes.
right? Who is a fertility god, god of the harbors, of the waters, protector of the
Yeah.
fruit trees. But Priapus occurs also in a lot of this kind of really erotic, bawdy poetry, but
Yeah.
also in these magical myths of deification and of one of the emperors was said to have been born by a phallus that was hidden inside of the sacred hearth of their home. And then he was actually a child of the spirits of the home, of the Lares, through this phallus, this Priapus phallus. And so there's
Wild.
also this idea with this hidden god again, connecting us to the agnostotheo, to Amun in the Egyptian. And remember, the Greek and the Egyptian are kind of blending with the Syriac and all of these Mediterranean cults. But yeah, this idea of finding that hidden phallus and of weaponizing and wielding, of ascending the throne and being empowered in that energy, of becoming that emperor. This is a true, powerful kind of magical occulted thing.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Let's go to the next slide. In this letter, we have encountered the cane or staff of St. Patrick not solely as a magical weapon, but also as a kind of repository of ideas with both organic and generative properties, and with a rhythmic intensity resembling the tom-toms when struck on the ground. In the letter to Colette Thomas, he writes, Artaud further adds that the weapons I speak of are no joke. They're based on the power of the breath, mine. My cane would release terrible flames when it struck the ground, and many people saw this, but nobody wanted to remember it, and everyone would have preferred that I forget it. He will be more careful when enacting his ideas on the theatre and affirming the truth of poetry, as he cannot trust society as it stands after the experiences of his journey in 1936 and 1937. In the letter to Henri Thomas of March 21st, 1946, from Rodez, Artaud relates an incident where he was attacked and what he will do as a result. Only this time I will not affirm the truth of poetry as in Dublin, where I suffered an aggression from an agent provocateur, who, as I was walking by with my cane in front of a square, in front of which I wanted to look at the window display of a bookstore, I was dealt a terrible blow to the back of my head, following which I struck him with my cane and raised an uproar in Dublin, and the police hid the fact that I had been assaulted and attacked before striking. This time, one, I will avoid being attacked because I know that Paris is full of aggressive police who, as in Dublin, are only waiting for an occasion to trip me up. And two, I will now know to avoid writing and speaking to just anyone as I used to before 1937, which will allow me to say even more virulent and terrible things from a perspective of such certain truth. From the bottom of my screw and tapwork at the bottom of the ingrown furrow of my termite nest that even the ancient provocateur's unconsciousness will be neutralized by the total devaluation of his rates. For Artaud, the unconscious was the realm where spirits dwell and struggle to incarnate the plague of the mind. It is a fake world of demons, half incarnated and half unreal, unlike the vital of consciousness. This might also be Artaud's subtle attack on surrealism and its ideas of the unconscious as a creative place for artists to explore. Nevertheless, Artaud had learned a lesson after the experiences of 1937 and distrusted the civilized places, the Parisian literary society, and the reliance on tradition and convention. He now imagines the countryside as a better location to perform a spectacle, to enact the ideas of his theater of cruelty. He would eventually have his chance to create a public spectacle, but this time using the medium of sound recording. During several recording sessions in late 1947 and early 1948, Artaud began recording the texts and sounds for "To Have Done with the Judgment of God," which is crazy, crazy text.
We
If you
have a
go to my
recording
link,
of it.
in the link tree, I recited the entire thing and I set it to weird soundscapes and stuff.
Yeah,
It
it's
was
so
it was,
much
it was a
fun.
it was fun, but check out the original recording itself. It's totally wild. Barber writes about Artaud's intention at this time. In To Have Done with the Judgment of God, Artaud aims to reach the body directly, to establish an existence for the body in which all influence, all nature, and all culture are torn away, so that the body is by itself, honed to bone and nerve as pure intention, without family, society, or religion. The
Becoming the
broadcast of this
fool of the tarot, right? Becoming
is the
Dionysus,
Momo.
the everyman, the Xenos, the Momo, right?
Exactly.
Going
This,
back to that childlike wonder and innocence, not caught up in the detritus of human history and tradition and culture.
exactly. The broad just wild. It's a wild
Right?
recording. You should listen to it, even though it's in French. It's absolutely mind blowing, like how intense it is. The broadcast of this recording was eventually banned for obscenity. Artaud was furious, but the clarity of his vision was undiminished. Artaud replied to the various scandals surrounding the recording that the duty of the writer, of the poet, is not to cowardly shut himself away in a text, a book, a magazine from which he will never emerge, but on the contrary, to emerge, to go outside, to shake and attack the mind of the public. If not, what use is he? One of my favorite quotes. This is Artaud's attack on poets who stay in an ivory tower and avoid direct action in the world. To the end of his life, he never forgot the necessity for absolute revolution. Artaud would present a more radical approach to transformation than the serialists had ever dreamed of. Nothing less than the complete destruction of the Western civilization would change things as they are. Artaud used every weapon to assault the world, whether it be the breath, the hand, the cane, or sound. In another letter to Henri Thomas on March 15, 1946, from Rodez, Artaud speaks of the history of the various attributions of the cane and imagines himself in a former life as a kind of Christ-like figure, distinct from the historical Christ, the Jewish pederast priest of the time. Yeah, I love that line.
Oh wow, gotta love Artaud. Just
Yeah,
calling it out, right?
no filter, no filter. 5,000, this is what he's talking about his past lives that I mentioned earlier. 5,000 years ago, I was in China with a cane attributed to history to one named Lao Tzu. But 2,000 years ago, I was in Judea, and I remember very well being macerated there for 3 days in a heap of manure, where I had been thrown like the body of a dead animal after having been quartered, or on some kind of post, thrashed and ridiculed by the cops and the common people at the time as in Ireland, Le Havre, Rouen, and Paris. The cane I had at the time was attributed in history to the one named Jesus Christ, who was a Jewish pederast priest of the time, and it strangely resembles the one which I went to Ireland and which carries an indelible trace of blood on its pommel. But it is my cane, mine, Artaud's, and not the cane of that Jewish priest who was called at the time, I believe, Salem or Nalpas. In the letter,
Wow.
yeah, what do you think of that? Pretty
I
wild, eh?
just it
The
is
cane
just
attributed
wild,
to Lao Tzu.
because and Lao Tzu again is very much, a Dionysian type figure from the East, right? And similar kind of thing as this, one who is returning to that state of primitive man, right? When you look at the Tao of Lao Tzu, right, it's all about going in the flow, abandoning all of this obsession with trying to build and it's returning back to a primal flow with nature. And that's something that's so intrinsic to Artaud.
It
Also, I just
is.
think it's wild that he is calling out the Jewish pederast thing, right? Jesus is a Jewish pederast. This would have been beyond controversial at his time,
Yeah, yeah.
like that. That isn't. It's a controversial, radical thing to say now, right? But there is some clear
Things,
black magical imagery connected to the Jesus story that fits in line with that can't be denied. Now, I'm not one to talk about truth in this regard, but if you're looking at the corpus of Christianity, there is darkness there that can't be ignored, right?
definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
In the letter to Henri Thomas of March 21st, 1946, Artaud reveals more information about the cane. This next passage is wild. A doctor told me a few weeks ago, if you believe in former lives, I will put you through electroshock or insulin therapy. But my former lives reside in a cane with an iron pommel, and I am sure it will be returned to me. Here the cane is a repository of his previous lives. Artaud was reminded of the Christ-like persecution he underwent in Ireland, Le Havre, and Paris in 1937. Judea, Ireland, Le Havre, Paris, Lao Tzu, Jesus Christ. These place names or historical figures are fluid entities and act like Artaud's doubles. Artaud identifies with the historical persona of Christ in an historical place resembling Judea to destabilize the sacredness of person or place. Artaud, Christ, Judea, Ireland. It is as though though the body without organs can assume an alternate persona for the sake of deflating the dominant idea of the sacred. As a pagan god, Artaud was all persons as well as no person, an absolutely autonomous body. Artaud was
He
creating
is
alternative
Dionysus.
genealogies. Yeah,
He's the
calling it
fool of
out
the
right here.
tarot. Who is Dionysus, right? Like, come on.
It's all right. It's all here.
It's all here.
Artaud is creating alternative genealogies that stand against the official record, the medical report, the polished literary work in order to allow for the opening of a consciousness towards possibility beyond measure. This journey to Ireland was on his mind when a week before his death he gave his lecture to Jean Destin from Le Figaro littéraire on February 28th, 1948. He told the interviewer, referring to when he was struck with an iron bar in Dublin, and it was on that day that the terrible torture started, which, according to psychiatrists, are the result of hallucinations. To the very end of his life, Artaud's work was centered on the body and its transformation. He writes on February 23rd, a theater of blood, a theater where at each performance something will be born, something will be won physically. In reality, the theater is the birth of creation. This echoes a
Wow.
passage in Artaud's letter to Martha Robert, written on March 29th, 1946, from Espalion, showing the central importance of the cane for Artaud's project. I am very strong, but not as much as I should be for things to return to the way they were with my cane, which I must also retrieve. But it does not suffice to accuse destiny. One must act with hand and with hammer. For Artaud, the gestural immediacy and vitality of a seizing hand could cut away mental processes from the body with the blow of a hammer or cane. In fact, Artaud had a hammer that he would bang on a piece of wood while screaming various sounds. Because it does not suffice to accuse destiny. One must act with hand and with hammer. These acts using a cane or hammer release the energy of the body into the surrounding air, where Artaud felt the spirits materialize. He was also venting his rage. Artaud's fury remained undiminished, and the apocalyptic vision for mankind led upon a journey beginning in Mexico in 1936 and ending tragically in Ireland in 1937, with a mental breakdown in silence, is very much on his mind near the end of his life. In the same interview from February 1928, 1948, Artaud told Jean Destin, "At this moment, I want to destroy my thought and my mind. Above all, thought, mind, and consciousness. I do not want to suppose anything, admit anything, enter into anything, discuss anything." His life ended in wild and raw obliteration, just as he had always wanted. And he died,
Wow.
I believe, March 4th, if I remember, early in March 1948, by a chloral hydrate overdose. It was presumed to be not intentional. He would take like crazy amount of drugs, and whenever he could get his hand on it, just do as much as possible. And results suffering intestinal hemorrhages. He would like pass out and wake up in pools of his blood. And yeah, eventually died in a tragic way.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. So not shortly after that, right? 1948. And
Just a
then,
few days later.
yeah, and uh just such a wow. What a wild, wild little essay talking about the Jesus staff and talking about his
Right?
really, really well. I loved this book. This book was really, really well
It's
done.
great.
You know, having gone through, like 30 or well, between you and I, we've read so many Artaud books. This has got to be one of my favorites for something that
I hear
is
you.
drawing from so many different sources. And
It
Valente has a really good explanation and without putting words in Artaud's mouth. Like we love to put words in
exactly.
Artaud's mouth.
Yeah. It's reinforced for me a lot of hypotheses I already had, but then new stuff as well that just like reaffirms these older assumptions that I had. It's kind of like, oh yeah, he's saying it right here and right out in the open.
Right? That whole line where he's becoming a pagan god who's the everyman, so he's Dionysus.
Yeah.
That sealed it for me. I'm just like, love it, love it, love it, love it. I'm gonna have to pick up this book because this
I
is a great
recommend it. You can
show,
get it from
man.
Infinity Land Press.
Yep. I'll bring up the website here so you guys could see. We love Infinity Land Press. It's one of our all-time favorite
I
publications.
have like
Um,
16 of their publications, 8 of which are on Artaud
yeah,
or from
please,
Artaud.
please support both the writer Peter Valente and the
Yeah.
publication house. Right, they make incredible, incredible stuff.
Each work is a beautiful work of art, and something that really tickles my dendrites is that all the Artaud books are the same trim size, so they stack perfectly, like symmetrically. That just
which is
that gets me.
amazing. Right, right. So now you can have this wall of cream Artaud, all perfect.
Exactly,
Right,
exactly.
sitting on your bookshelf.
You know,
Mm.
I have 25 books of Artaud, 3 of which are about Artaud, the other 22 are written by Artaud. And it's just wild. I love it. I'm always
Right.
discovering things every time I reread, you know?
Exactly. And this has been one of the more interesting books that we've discussed about Artaud. That's not his direct writing. Uh, and
Exactly.
it's this is a subject that's dear to us, and we've been looking for someone who's going to explore it from this angle in a really kind of balanced way. And I think Peter Valente arose to the occasion and
Achieve
did a
that.
fantastic job. You
Absolutely.
know, and we really get to see this sort of, you know, he situates him within within the cult milieu of his time, right? As this radical kind of reformation, because Artaud is taken from so many different places. You know, it's not like the big mistake that we're seeing in a lot of the previous writings is trying to limit him to the Gnostic approach. So much of what we've seen
Yeah.
where people are trying to interpret his magic is always through that limited lens of Gnosticism. But when you apply it to the Western magical tradition, all of a sudden,
Falls
all of
short.
it starts to make sense. You know, Gnosticism is a part of that tradition, you know, and like
Yeah, yeah. He's digging deeper than us,
he's digging deeper,
yeah.
you know, and there's a lot of really
Um,
cool stuff here.
oh, definitely. This is also one of my favorite Artaud books. Um, Peter Valente just does an exceptional job, and yeah, you should get
Yep. Make sure you
it.
support the artists and the translators, you know, great work. Oh, one final interesting thing. When I was doing some searching around, I found some found some message boards that were talking about that Artaud staff may not have been lost and it may be in private collector hands.
I've been told by someone, the specific person who may own it.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Yeah, I
which
heard
is
rumors it's a musician from
I heard rumors it's one of the members of Coil.
yeah, that's it. Exactly. Which would be
Whether
like,
it's true or not, yeah, it's
but
fun to think about.
it's fun to think about because we honestly could do a whole searching for dragons episode on Coil. So
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
right. So I'm glad to, if it's in their hands, we know it's in good hands and it's continued to inspire. So that's
Yeah.
really beautiful stuff. So any last thoughts or anything you want to leave our audience with in terms of the obliteration of the world by Peter Valente?
Um, that's a good question. What do you think?
I mean,
You turn it on its head.
what do I want to leave? I just want people to recognize this. For me, the key to understanding Artaud, and I know that Peter Valente didn't get too deep into it, is connecting him to the Greek magical theatrical tradition, to the Dionysian. And that really
Right.
explains all of it for me. That connects the tarot, that connects his whole obliteration of the self. It connects
Yeah,
all
yeah.
his Gnosticism. You know, we need to write a book about Artaud. I mean, not to
I've
dismiss what
dream.
Valente has said,
I dream of it. I dream
you
of,
know, because everything
you
Valenti said
know.
is true and is amazing. It's just I want to go one step further and situate him within a specific magical current rather than
That'd be
just have him
interesting.
as playing within all of these currents. I mean, he's certainly
Right,
playing
right.
within multiple currents, but I don't know. He's interesting.
Yeah, it'd be
I mean,
fun to explore.
you know, I mean, Valenti clearly sees all of these parallels, even if he doesn't call them out directly, because he connects them to Crowley, and Crowley is operating in the same vein, right? It's Crowley who turns the fool into Dionysus, right? When you look
Yeah.
at his version,
I,
he
but
tells you it explicitly in his version of the tarot. The fool is Dionysus diffuse, the two-horned Dionysus, the androgynous Dionysus, who has the
yeah,
sun in his genitals. You know, so it's like
yeah. I
right.
really
So
want
all of
to.
that is there.
I really want to finish. I'm still working through it, but Peter Valente's most recent work is a translation of some amazing Artaud work called "The True Story of Artaud Momo," and just as a little teaser, he talks about being in Mexico, and the guide is leading him into the Tarahumara lands, and the indigenous people are making like rude gestures. Is what are they doing? They say they're masturbating to cast a curse on you because they know that you're coming with a knowledge and the seeking for understanding that they can't tolerate existing, like permeating and like in the rest of reality. Like
Oh wow.
they know why you're here, and they're masturbating to curse you.
That would have messed our toe rate up. Totally fed into his.
Right? It fed into his delusion that like yeah, yeah. So that's
But
just
this is the
little
thing, though.
teaser for what's to come.
As a kind of a magical person, this is only my own. I see all these Artaud called an apocalypse upon himself. He spent 9 years in isolation. That is the hermit. The hermit card in the tarot is the 9. He had 9 years of isolation to engage in this process of refinement, where he went to the crossroads and was in the liminal lands of the dead. You know, like, to
Wow.
me, it was a true magical empowerment that he called upon himself, you know?
Definitely.
And I
Definitely.
just noticed the parallels. Now, that's me talking as a radical, weird occult person. So take that with a grain of salt. But this is my perspective,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a damn interesting perspective. Very compelling.
you know. Ultimately, I see Artaud. I think what's important to get it from this is to recognize that Artaud's theatrical performance and his philosophy is one of true radical self-empowerment and enlightenment. And even though he's coming at it from this, a lot of people get bogged down with Artaud in terms of the extremism, the cruelty, the black magic, you know, the presumption of insanity, the experiences he went through. But when you really pierce to the depths of Artaud's system, it's a systematic idea about trying to transcend reality, to become God itself, and to recreate the self in one's own image, right? To go through this ionic
Exactly.
life, right? Something that is just so occult and magical.
Yeah. 100%. And it's keep in mind that the theater at this time was very like, oh, hoity-toity, and then he was sort of being like, we must destroy the audience, the barrier between the audience, and we must dismember in front of them. We must like attack their minds so that we can create a new reality from the explosion of consciousness.
Right. We have to remember
Um,
that theater became high art, right? After post Shakespeare, it's starting to become this form where you're actually creating and enculturating, your entirety of your culture, artists, um,
yeah, it was around the late late 1600s or late 1700s when they introduced the fourth wall. Before then, it
right,
didn't exist. Even with Shakespeare, there was no fourth wall. That's what the asides are. The soliloquy is.
right,
They're addresses to the audience
right.
and a chance to
And I
connect
mean,
the audience to their performance.
right, and even in Shakespeare, sometimes you have the chorus, right? The chorus is
Exactly.
the embodiment of the audience, and they get to participate in the performance. They come literally onto the stage, but in the Greek understanding, they would have seen that as the mirror of them, themselves upon the stage, which is
Exactly.
so interesting. There
Exactly.
is exactly this fourth wall never existed and also, right, in the Greco-Roman tradition, right? They're performing these at the festival to Dionysus, at the city
Yeah.
Dionysia. This is about a transformation, and everyone is wrecked on entheogens the entire time, drinking wine, partying down, and they're engaging in these radical transformations. Like, we've talked about this a lot, right? The actors are entering into the skene, right? The skene is the vulva, the clitoris. They're going back into the cosmic womb to be
To be
reborn and to
rebirthed.
come out as a new character, to don a new mask, right?
Exactly.
Wild
Exactly.
stuff. Beautiful stuff. Oh, thank you so much for the donation, Long Shot. All the love in the world to you. I'm glad you've been enjoying this discussion on Artaud.
Love
I
it.
am the beast. I worship. See you on the ninth wave. Nice to meet you, beast. Enjoy that
Love
night.
it.
But yeah, um, wild stuff here. Anything you want to? Any last thoughts
Any last thoughts? Destroy
on
yourself to become
obliteration?
yourself.
Destroy yourself, become yourself. Rise and become the God. Don't be constantly submitting to some hidden God that has removed itself from reality, but rather ascend to the throne and become the divine in your own world, right?
Exactly.
Wild, wild power here. Um, Beautiful, beautiful. Reform the body, this time without organs. All
Yes.
right. So we're ending here. But as you said, we're going to be returning soon. We want to do, it's going to be a couple weeks because you're still reading, digging into the other Palenti book. What was it titled again?
The true story of Arto Momo.
So that is on the horizon. Next week we want to dive in. We're gonna have some fun. I've been digging into Mary Shelley, the Goth mother, the founder of modern science fiction as we know it, and one of the most wild writers of all time. So we're going to be digging specifically into her incredible book, The Last Man, and this is widely considered the first true post-apocalyptic novel. And so we're going to have fun with this, the idea of the death of humanity, of Western civilization, of romanticism, of patriarchy, right? All of these ideas and what that could potentially mean. And is death a real end? You know, so we're going to have some fun. Mary Shelley is one of these truly wild figures in history, one of the most important authors of all time. And we're going to have a blast getting into her. So that's what we're going to be getting into in the next couple of weeks. Mary Shelley's The Last Man and Peter Valente's Artaud de Momo. Also, we plan to get together because Graham, you have a new poetry collection that you're about to release. Can you tell us about this?
Yet again, yet another.
Always.
So it's going to be my 25th self-publication, which, at the year 2025, why not put up my 25th book, right?
Beautiful.
It's called A New Reality, my intimate relationship with clozapine. And it's a series of journals and poems that I've written since from January to now, following my treatment procedure with a new medication that I've been trying, which has like deeply impacted my everyday life in ways that I can't really get into right now. But
yeah,
it'll be ready soon. I'm waiting on the proof copy, so I'll get that tomorrow or Monday. If it looks good, then it goes to print.
I'm really excited to read this because, it has been something that's totally transformed your whole life and your whole world, your whole way of thinking. Something like clozapine is such a undertaking because you have to go get regular blood work, and then it is affecting your entire psyche. So, and it's this constant struggle of trying to do the doses, right? You're pushing the threshold at the moment, are you not?
Pushing the boundaries. Yeah, it's I'll be at the recommended max dose pretty soon, and it'll be the 20th medication that I've tried.
Wild stuff. So I'm really looking forward to reading these journals and to having that discussion for you. So make sure you guys stay tuned and look forward to those episodes. We'll be doing an interview with Graham, as well as episodes on Mary Shelley's The Last Man and Peter Valente's Artaud de Momo. So thank you guys all for tuning in. This has been Searching for Dragons. Peace and love. Any last words?
Laugh, cry, do it all. Keep moving forward.
Beautiful. Thank you guys for joining us, and take care. We'll see you later. Have a wonderful evening.